Nobody walks away from that ring." Elena's hands didn't shake when she heard those words. She set down her tray, turned slowly, and looked at the man who said them. Marco Russo, 260 pounds of undefeated violence, and said the 4 words that stopped every conversation in the room. "Then I'll walk through." If this story already has your heart pounding, subscribe to our channel right now and follow every part of this story until the very end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The Black Orchid didn't look like a place where lives ended. From the outside, it looked like exactly what Adrian Valenti wanted the world to think. It was a premium private club on the Upper West Side, the kind of establishment where the lighting was expensive and the silence was deliberate. Black marble floors, crystal glasses that caught candlelight and scattered it in directions that made wealthy men feel important. Staff who moved without sound, who refilled drinks before the glass was empty, who existed only as extensions of the room itself, rather than as human beings with names and histories. Elena Moretti had worked the Friday night shift at the Black Orchid for 11 months, and in those 11 months she had perfected the art of being invisible. That wasn't a metaphor. It was a survival skill. She carried her tray through the crowd, the way water moves through a narrow channel, finding the path of least resistance, adjusting without hesitation, never drawing attention to the adjustment itself. She had learned the layout of every table from memory in her first week. She had learned the preferences of every regular by the third. Mr. Carbone at table 7 always wanted his bourbon with 1 cube, not 2. Mr. DeLuca near the back preferred to be approached from his left because his hearing was worse on the right side. The 2 men who always sat together near the far window, she never learned their names, didn't want to drink sparkling water all night and left tips larger than some people's weekly paychecks. And Elena had long ago decided that the size of a tip and the nature of a man's business were directly proportional in ways she preferred not to examine too closely. She was good at her job because she paid attention to everything and acknowledged nothing. That was the rule. The only rule that mattered in a place like this. See everything. React to nothing. The Friday night crowd was larger than usual, and Elena had understood why the moment she arrived for her shift. Marco Russo had won again. His 4th fight in 6 weeks, each one shorter than the last, each one more decisive. The celebration energy in the room had that particular texture. She recognized the kind of excitement that sat right next to cruelty, that needed an outlet and hadn't found one yet. Men with too much alcohol and too much money and too much certainty that the night belonged to them. She had worked in rooms like this before, not as a waitress, but that was a different life, and she had buried it carefully. And tonight was just a shift, and she needed the money, and if she kept her head down and her hands busy and her face professionally pleasant, she would be back in her apartment by 2 in the morning, and nobody in this room would remember she existed. That was the plan. Plans in Elena Moretti's experience had a way of surviving only until reality decided otherwise. She was crossing from the bar toward table 4 when she heard Adrian Valenti laugh. She had heard him laugh before, not often, not genuinely, but occasionally, in the performative way that powerful men laugh when they want a room to understand something without saying it directly. This laugh was different. Lower, more private. The kind of sound that meant something specific was amusing him, and what amused Adrian Valenti usually meant something unfortunate for somebody nearby. Elena didn't look up. She placed the drinks at table 4, confirmed the order, adjusted her grip on the empty tray, and turned to navigate back toward the bar. That was when Dominic Ferry stumbled. Dominic was one of Adrian's younger associates, 24 years old and 3 drinks past his limit, and he had been moving backward through the crowd laughing at something someone behind him said, when his shoulder connected with Elena's tray. The impact wasn't violent. It was just the ordinary careless physics of a young man who had never learned to be aware of the people around him who weren't worth being aware of. The tray went sideways. 4 champagne flutes, crystal, expensive, the kind that shattered into a sound that stopped. A room began their trajectory toward the marble floor. Elena had already moved, not in the frantic, panicked way of someone trying to prevent disaster. Not with the desperate overcorrection that usually resulted in breaking something different in the process of trying to save the original thing. She moved with a kind of quiet, immediate precision that came from somewhere deeper than training. One hand redirected the tray. 2 fingers closed around the stem of the first glass. Her body shifted 2 inches left to rebalance her center of gravity. And all 4 champagne flutes settled back onto the tray without a sound. The whole thing lasted less than 2 seconds. Dominic had already started to apologize, expecting the noise of breaking glass, expecting the mess, expecting the kind of visible catastrophe that would require him to offer money or attention or explanation. Instead, he found Elena looking at him calmly, with 4 intact glasses on a level tray and an expression on her face that communicated without unkindness that the incident was already finished. "Sorry," he said anyway, confused. "No damage," she said. She kept moving. What Elena didn't notice, what she had no reason to notice, because her job was to not notice things like this, was that Adrian Valenti had seen the entire sequence from across the room. He had been watching her for 40 seconds before the tray incident happened, which was not something he would have explained to anyone, because he wasn't entirely sure himself why his attention had caught on her specifically. The room was full of staff moving between tables. Elena was dressed identically to 5 other waitresses working the same floor. She was not doing anything exceptional or unusual. But there was something in the way she moved. Something in the quality of her attention. He had spent 20 years reading rooms, reading people, reading the small physical details that told him who was afraid, who was lying, who was performing confidence. They didn't actually feel who was genuinely dangerous and who was dangerous only in their own imagination. It was a skill that had kept him alive when other men in his position had been destroyed. And when he watched Elena cross the room, something in that skill registered something he couldn't immediately name. The tray incident clarified it. Most people, almost all people, would have gasped, would have flinched, would have shown some visible response to the sudden near disaster of expensive glassware falling on a marble floor in a room full of people whose attention they desperately did not want. Even experienced waitstaff showed something: a quickened breath, a brief tension in the jaw, a fractional widening of the eyes. Elena showed nothing. No surprise, no fear, no relief when she caught the glasses. Just the calm, immediate competence of someone who had trained themselves to operate in high-stakes moments without the emotional interference that slowed most people down. Adrian set down his own glass. He said something quiet to the man beside him, who nodded and stepped back. Then he walked across the room in the direction Elena had gone. She was at the bar when he reached her, her back to him, setting the champagne flutes down. With the same professional care she gave everything. She didn't hear him approach. The music in the room was too dense for footsteps, but she registered his presence the moment he stopped beside her. He saw the slight adjustment in her posture. The way her hands didn't freeze kept working, but something shifted in the quality of her stillness. She knew who was standing next to her without turning around. That was interesting too. "You don't scare easily," he said. She turned then. Not quickly, not slowly. Just turned the way someone turns when they've decided to acknowledge something they already knew was happening. She looked at him for a moment before answering. Her eyes were dark brown and very direct, and there was nothing in them that he expected to find. No nervousness, no excitement at being addressed by him personally. No calculation about what the attention might mean for her. Just the straightforward assessment of someone who looked at things clearly and made decisions about them. "I work nights," she said, "in places like this." She picked up her tray again. "You learn quickly who's genuinely dangerous and who just wants you to think they are." She moved to leave. "Which category do I fall into?" he asked. She glanced back over her shoulder. "I haven't decided yet." At the table nearest the fighting ring, 3 of Adrian's senior associates exchanged looks. In 11 years of working for Adrian Valenti, not one of them had heard a member of the service staff speak to him that way and continue walking. Adrian didn't move for a moment. Then slowly, he smiled. Not the social smile he used with business partners, or the intimidating smile he used with people who needed reminding of where they stood. Something different. Something closer to genuine surprise, which was rare enough in his life to be noteworthy. He turned back toward the room. Marco Russo was standing near the ring, accepting congratulations, a drink in one hand, and the particular posture of a man who had never doubted he was the most physically formidable presence in any space he occupied. 263 pounds, 6'4", a record of 41 fights and 41 victories in the underground circuit that Adrian had run for the past 6 years. Some of those victories had lasted under a minute. Nobody in the room in the city, in any space Adrian controlled, believed that Marco Russo could be beaten. Adrian believed it too. Until tonight, he had never questioned it. He looked at the waitress navigating back through the crowd, and something moved in his mind. A connection between her composure at the bar and the composure he had watched her maintain during the tray incident, and a question he knew was absurd, but that formed itself anyway. He picked up his glass. He raised his voice just enough to carry over the conversation nearest him. "Titan." Marco turned. Adrian gestured toward the ring. "They tell me nobody in New York believes you can be beaten." Marco grinned. The room around him echoed it, the comfortable laugh of men who believed they were safe in their certainty. "Nobody can," Marco said. Adrian nodded slowly. His eyes moved across the room until they found Elena again standing at a table near the window. "I want to put that claim to a proper test," he said. He raised his glass higher, and his voice carried further. "Anyone who defeats my champion tonight." The room quieted. Conversation stopped in rings moving outward from where he stood, like sound dying when a stone drops into water. "I'll marry them." The laughter started immediately. The comfortable, dismissive laughter of men who understood that this was theater, that Adrian Valenti, saying something dramatic, was Adrian Valenti entertaining himself and them simultaneously, that the statement was about power and spectacle and nothing else. Elena heard it from across the room. She didn't laugh with everyone else. She stood very still with her order pad in her hand, and she looked at Adrian Valenti across the crowd of laughing men, and something in her face shifted by a fraction too small for anyone nearby to notice. What she was thinking in that moment, nobody in the room knew. Nobody asked. She was the waitress, and waitresses didn't have thoughts that mattered in places like this. She was background. She was furniture. She removed her apron. The folding was careful, almost formal. She smoothed each crease with the back of her hand, aligned the edges, set the apron down on the edge of the nearest table, with the deliberateness of someone completing a transaction that had already been decided. Then she walked toward the ring. The laughter stopped before she was halfway there, not all at once. In pieces, one man noticing and going quiet, then the man beside him, then the cluster at the next table. A spreading silence that followed her across the room, because something in the way she moved created a quality of attention that nobody could quite explain, but nobody could ignore. She walked like someone who knew exactly where they were going and had already considered what would happen when they got there. Marco Russo turned to watch her approach. His expression moved through amusement and settled somewhere between confusion and contempt. "You're serious," he said. "Are you declining?" she asked. "I'll hurt you." "Probably," she agreed. "Step into the ring." Adrian Valenti stood completely still. His heartbeat in that moment did something it had not done in years. It accelerated, not from fear, not from excitement in any way he recognized, from uncertainty. For the first time in a very long time, Adrian Valenti did not know what was going to happen next. Marco Russo did not take Elena Moretti seriously. This was not unusual. This was not even a failure of intelligence on his part. It was the straightforward result of everything he had ever been taught about how physical confrontation worked. Size was advantage, weight was advantage, strength was advantage, experience was advantage, and Marco Russo had all of those things, while the woman standing across from him in black waitress shoes had none of them. He had fought 30 men who outweighed and outmatched most of the population. He had fought trained professionals. He had fought desperate men who had everything to lose and knew it. He had never once seriously entertained the possibility that a woman who had been carrying drinks 40 minutes ago would give him something to think about. Elena was watching his feet. This was the detail that mattered. Not his shoulders, not his eyes, not the obvious telegraphing of his hands that most fighters looked for. His feet. Because feet told you where weight was committed before the rest of the body had finished making the decision, and a committed weight was a predictable weight, and predictable movement was manageable regardless of the force behind it. She had learned this in a different life, not in a gym, not from a trainer. From someone who had explained to her with quiet and precise seriousness that physical confrontation for a person of her size against opponents significantly larger was never about strength and was entirely about the management of timing and space. That the difference between losing badly and not losing at all was the willingness to wait longer than felt comfortable before committing to any action, because the impulse to move too early was the most reliable way to give a larger opponent exactly what they needed. She waited. Marco moved first. He always moved first. It was the luxury of size, the confidence of a man who had never been made to understand the cost of commitment. His opening was a controlled test, conservative by his standards, but still fast, still heavy, still carrying the kind of force that had ended evenings for men twice Elena's weight. She wasn't there, not in the dramatic, theatrical way of a film fight. No spinning, no acrobatics. She simply wasn't in the space he had aimed at, and she was briefly in a different space, and the geometry of where she was positioned when his attempt completed was subtly worse for him than it had been a second before. He turned. He tried again. Faster this time. She wasn't there. The room had gone completely quiet. This was different from the silence when she had walked to the ring. That silence had been surprise. This silence was something else, the held-breath quality of a crowd that had begun to understand they were watching something they hadn't anticipated and weren't entirely sure how to categorize. Dominic Ferry, still standing near the bar, where he'd been since the tray incident, realized his mouth was open and closed it. One of Adrian's senior associates, a man named Vincent, who had seen every fight Marco had ever won and lost count of which number he was on, leaned toward the man beside him and said nothing. There was nothing to say. He just leaned forward slightly, the physical expression of increased attention. Marco reset. He was not panicking. He was not rattled. He was recalibrating the way experienced fighters do when they discover the first approach isn't working. He expanded his read of the space. He adjusted for her likely movement patterns based on what he'd seen so far. He was methodical, and he was good, and he had been in tight moments before, and resolved them. What he was missing, what he could not have known because there was no observable evidence for it, was that Elena was ahead of him. Not ahead of him in speed. Not ahead of him in any physical dimension. Ahead of him in sequence. She had in the preceding 90 seconds watched 3 complete cycles of his instinctive response pattern, the specific combination of foot position and weight shift and shoulder angle that preceded each different type of move. She had cataloged them. She knew which response he was going to select before his body had finished selecting it, not because she was psychic, but because she had spent years learning to read exactly this kind of information from exactly this kind of person in situations where the cost of getting it wrong was much higher than a fight in a private club. When he committed again, she didn't step away. She stepped into the space his movement created. The room made a sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a shout, something collective and involuntary. What happened in the next several seconds was technically complicated and visually appeared almost quiet. Not the explosive violence of a movie fight, not the brutal impact that the crowd was accustomed to seeing in this ring. It was the use of committed force against itself, which is an application of principle so simple in concept and so difficult in execution that most people who understood it intellectually could not actually perform it. Elena could perform it. Marco Russo hit the floor. The sound of it was very clear in the silent room. He was down for 4 seconds before he understood what had happened. He had never been on the floor before. The disorientation was not physical. He was not badly hurt, not concussed, not seriously injured. It was conceptual. His entire experience of himself as a fighter of his body, as an instrument of reliable dominance, had just produced an outcome that should not have been possible, and the 4 seconds he spent on the floor were the 4 seconds it took his mind to begin processing the information. He got up. He looked at Elena. Elena was breathing slightly harder than when she'd started. Her hair had come partially loose from where she'd pinned it. She was standing in a position of readiness that she held without performing it. Not aggressive, not triumphant, just ready to continue if continuation was required. Marco looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back. He stepped out of the ring. That was the end of the fight. The room didn't react immediately. There was a collective beat of stunned non-reaction, the human equivalent of a system processing information that doesn't fit existing frameworks. And then, someone near the back of the crowd exhaled audibly, and the sound broke the spell, and the room erupted, not cheering, not the celebratory noise of a crowd that had backed the winner. Something more confused and urgent, the sound of 100 people simultaneously trying to make sense of something and talking to each other about it, because talking was the only available tool. Elena walked out of the ring. She went back to the table where she'd left her apron. She picked it up. She was in the process of putting it back on when she became aware of Adrian Valenti standing in front of her. She hadn't heard him approach through the noise of the room. She looked up. His expression was something she hadn't expected to see on his face. She had read him in the months she'd worked here as a man who projected control the way other people projected warmth, constantly, deliberately, as both genuine expression of character and calculated social strategy. The face that looked at her now was the face of someone who was not currently managing his expression. He was genuinely surprised. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was quiet. The question wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't a power display. It was what it sounded like, a man asking a question he needed answered because he didn't have the answer. Elena finished tying her apron. "Someone who wants to finish her shift," she said. She picked up her tray. "Mr. Valenti, you made a public statement in front of several hundred people." She glanced at him. "That's going to be interesting for you to manage." She moved toward table 7, where Mr. Carbone's bourbon glass was running low. Adrian didn't follow her. He stood in the middle of the room with his hands in his pockets, and around him, his men were looking at each other, and at him, and at the woman calmly returning to her job, and the question moving through all of them was the same question he was already asking himself. Who exactly was she? Go. It took his people 4 hours to find the beginning of an answer. Adrian was in his office on the upper floor of the Black Orchid when Vincent knocked, came in, and set a folder on the desk. The folder was thin. That was the first thing Adrian noticed. In his experience, thin folders meant one of two things. Either a person had almost no history worth recording, or they had a history that had been very carefully hidden. Elena Moretti, Vincent said. 26, born Queens, single, no criminal record, works 3 jobs. The Black Orchid Fridays and Saturdays, a diner in Midtown Tuesday through Thursday mornings, and some kind of night shift data entry work from home on other days. Adrian opened the folder. Before 11 months ago, Mr. Valenti Elena Moretti as a legal identity doesn't exist. He said it flatly, without drama. Vincent had been with Adrian long enough to understand that the most alarming information was best delivered without editorial emphasis. Adrian looked up from the folder. What does that mean? It means the Social Security number is real, she has one, she pays taxes on it, it's legitimate. But the credit history is 11 months old. The apartment lease is 11 months old. The employment records before the Black Orchid are thin and we can't verify them. No college records under this name. No medical records. No family documentation we can find. She built a new identity, Adrian said. A very good one, Vincent confirmed. Whoever helped her do it knew what they were doing. We can't find the seams from standard background work. We'd need... He paused. We'd need different resources. Adrian set down the folder. He was quiet for a moment. She's hiding, he said. Appears so. From what? We don't know yet. He stood, moved to the window. Below the club was still active, the night still running, the noise of it muffled by the floor between them, but still present. He thought about the way Elena had moved in the ring. The specific quality of it, not the technique itself, which was impressive, but the emotional texture beneath it. The absence of anger. The absence of the adrenaline response that ordinary people couldn't suppress in confrontational situations. The absolute calm. That kind of calm wasn't trained in a gym. That was the calm of someone who had operated in genuinely high-stakes situations and learned out of necessity to manage their own fear response to a degree that most people couldn't achieve. She was a professional, Adrian said, not a fighter, something else. Something where she used these skills differently. Vincent waited. Find out what? Adrian said. And find out who she was running from. He turned back from the window. And Vincent. Sir, do it quietly. I don't want her to know we're looking. Vincent nodded and left. Adrian sat back down at his desk. He opened the folder again and looked at the photograph they'd taken a still from the security footage in the club. Elena at the bar in her uniform before the fight, before any of it. Looking directly at the camera without knowing she was being filmed, and what struck him now studying the image was what he had noticed in person, but not consciously articulated. She was always watching the exits, not obsessively, not in the obvious paranoid way that would have made her memorable, but consistently systematically, with the practiced naturalness of someone who had trained themselves to always know where the exits were without appearing to look for them. That was not something a person did without a reason. Outside his office in the club below, Elena Moretti finished her shift. She collected her bag from the staff room. She put on her coat. She said goodnight to the bartender who said goodnight back in the particular way that indicated he was aware something significant had happened that night and was professionally pretending otherwise. She walked to the staff exit. Before she opened it, she stopped. She looked at the door for a moment. Then she pulled out her phone and opened an application that showed her a map of the 3-block radius around the Black Orchid, with small indicators she had placed herself months ago, the position of the nearest subway entrance, the location of a 24-hour diner, where she knew the staff, 2 different routes back to the main street that didn't overlap. She studied the map for 15 seconds. She put the phone away. She pushed open the door and walked into the night. The information arrived in pieces over the following 48 hours. The first piece came from a private investigator Adrian had used for sensitive matters for 12 years. A man who understood the difference between information that could be written down and information that was better delivered verbally in a room with no phones. He sat across from Adrian and said, 3 years ago, there was a corporate scandal involving a financial services firm called Meridian Capital. You may have seen the edges of it. It made some news before it didn't make news anymore. A financial investigator working for them internally found evidence of money laundering at a scale that implicated several people well above the firm's official structure. Political figures, law enforcement, the kind of connections that make evidence disappear and witnesses uncomfortable. Adrian waited. The investigator filed an internal report. Within 72 hours, her apartment was broken into. Her car was tampered with. She received a communication we don't know the exact nature, but the outcome was that she understood clearly that continuing to exist as herself was not a viable option. She disappeared, Adrian said. She disappeared. As far as anyone at Meridian Capital or connected to it knows, that investigator, a woman named Catherine Sorrell, is either dead or has left the country. Adrian said nothing for a long moment. Catherine Sorrell, he said finally. 29 at the time, now 32, specialized in forensic financial investigation. Before Meridian, she worked for 2 federal agencies in advisory capacities and a private risk assessment firm. By all accounts, exceptional at her job. What was her background beyond the financial work? She grew up in a complicated situation. Father was military, died when she was young. Mother remarried twice, both times badly. She put herself through school. Along the way, The investigator paused. She was involved with some people who trained her practically, not officially, not in any way that would show up on a record. But she grew up around people who knew how to handle themselves physically, and she learned from them. Where did she go after she disappeared? We don't know the details of the transition, but... He paused again, longer this time. Say it, Adrian said. The people who were involved in the Meridian situation. 3 of them are dead in the past 18 months. The official causes were varied accident, natural causes, one apparent suicide. But there are people in my network who believe those deaths were not coincidental." The room was very quiet. "You're telling me," Adrian said slowly, "that the woman who has been working in my club for 11 months as a waitress might be working her way through the people who tried to have her killed. I'm telling you the timing is interesting. I'm not in a position to confirm anything beyond that." Adrian stood. He went to the window. He stood there for a long time without speaking. Below, through the glass, the city moved, the way it always moved, indifferent, continuous. Everyone in it carrying their own unfinished business through the same streets and arriving at different ends. "She accepted the fight," Adrian said, quietly, almost to himself. He turned. "She didn't have to accept. She could have declined, walked away, let the moment pass. Nobody in that room actually expected her to step into that ring." He looked at the investigator. "Why did she accept?" The man across the desk looked back at him steadily. "Mr. Valenti, if I had to guess." "Guess." "A woman who has been hiding for 3 years, who has been methodically working toward something, who has been living in controlled invisibility. If the man who controls the most significant criminal infrastructure in this city publicly makes a statement about her in front of hundreds of witnesses." He paused. "The most dangerous thing she can do is walk away. Because walking away makes her memorable for the wrong reasons. It creates a story about her. But stepping into that ring and winning changes what the story is," Adrian said. "She's no longer the waitress who declined a challenge. She's the woman who defeated Adrian Valenti's champion. That's a different kind of attention. Controlled attention. A narrative she can use." Adrian was quiet. Then he said, "She knew exactly what she was doing." "Almost certainly. From the moment I spoke to her at the bar." The investigator didn't answer. The answer was already in the room. Adrian walked to his desk. He sat down. He put both hands flat on the surface in front of him and looked at the wall for a long moment. Elena Moretti. Catherine Sorel. A woman who had reinvented herself from a person being erased by powerful men into something he was still trying to accurately define. Who had walked into his club 11 months ago and had been watching his operation from the inside ever since. Who had tonight, in front of everyone who mattered in this world, done something that had never been done in 6 years of Friday night fights. And who had then gone back to work without a word, as if none of it had changed anything. He looked at the investigator. "The people she's moving through," he said. "The meridian connections. I need the full list. Some of them may be within your sphere, Mr. Valenti. That's the complication I was building toward." Adrian absorbed this without any visible reaction. "Which ones?" he asked. The investigator told him. Adrian sat with the information for a full 30 seconds. Then he said, "Get out." The man left. Adrian picked up his phone. He set it down. He picked it up again. He had spent 20 years building a world that operated on very clear principles. Power was quantifiable. Loyalty was testable. Threat was identifiable. The correct response to every situation was determinable by applying consistent logic to known variables. Elena Moretti. Catherine Sorel was not a known variable. She was something that his framework didn't have a clean category for. And the fact that she was currently somewhere in this city living under a name, she had built herself moving towards something she had decided 3 years ago she was going to finish, and that she had walked into his club to do it from the inside. He put the phone down. He looked at the ceiling. He said very quietly to no one in particular, "She came here on purpose." The realization settled, not like a shock. Like the moment when something you've been looking at indirectly finally resolves into a clear image. She had come to the Black Orchid on purpose. 11 months ago, she had taken a job in the one place in New York City that had among its regular clientele some of the people from the list she was working through. She had spent 11 months learning the landscape, the relationships, the connections, The flow of information and money and influence that moved through these rooms on Friday nights. And Adrian Valenti, the man who controlled all of it, had just publicly promised to marry her in front of everyone. He almost laughed. It died before it got there, because he was thinking about something else now. Something underneath the tactical picture. He was thinking about a woman who had spent 3 years in hiding, working jobs to survive, building a new name from scratch, living in the specific kind of loneliness that came from never being able to be who you actually were, and who had nonetheless shown up every shift with the kind of quiet competence and dignity that made her the best server on his floor. She hadn't collapsed. She hadn't lost herself. She had just kept working. He sat alone in his office for a long time after that, and the city moved below. And somewhere in it, Catherine Sorrell was in an apartment that only had 11 months of history, sleeping or not sleeping, carrying the weight of something very heavy with the same composure she brought to everything else. And Adrian Valenti, who had not been genuinely uncertain about another person in years, found himself with a question he didn't know the answer to. Not who she was. He knew that now. But what came next? For both of them. She didn't sleep that night, not because she was afraid. Fear was something Elena had learned to metabolize years ago, to take it in, break it down, convert it into information rather than paralysis. What kept her awake was the specific, controlled alertness of someone who had just changed the shape of a situation they'd spent 11 months carefully managing, and needed to think through every consequence of that change before morning arrived, and consequences started arriving on their own. She sat at the small table in her apartment with a glass of water and went through it methodically. The fight had accomplished 3 things. First, it had created a public record of her that was controlled. She existed now in the memory of everyone in that room, not as a woman running from something, but as a woman who had done something remarkable. Second, it had introduced complexity into Adrian Valenti's situation that he would now need to resolve, which redirected attention from her past toward his present. Third, and this was the part she had not fully calculated in advance, it had connected her to him in a way she hadn't entirely planned for. The marriage comment. She turned the glass slowly in her hands. That had been improvisation on his part, genuine surprise, expressing itself through the only language a man like Adrian Valenti had available. Power language, challenge language, the vocabulary of a man who was not accustomed to encounters that left him unsure of the terms. She had recognized it as improvisation in the moment. What she hadn't fully processed was the specific improvisation he had chosen. Marriage. In the world Adrian Valenti operated in, that word meant something very different from what it meant to other people. Marriage was alliance. Marriage was consolidation. Marriage was the formal announcement that a particular arrangement had been made, and that both parties were now under the protection and the obligation of that arrangement. He had said it publicly, which meant it couldn't be unsaid privately. She picked up her phone, opened the map application, looked at it for a moment, then set it down. Tomorrow, she decided. She would know more tomorrow about what he intended to do with the position he had put himself in, and she would make her decisions accordingly. She drank the water, went to her bed, and was asleep within 10 minutes. The discipline of that. The ability to compartmentalize and rest, when rest was strategically necessary, was one of the things that had kept Catherine Sorrell alive when Elena Moretti did not yet exist. He came to the club himself. She was working the Tuesday morning shift at the Midtown Diner when her phone showed an unknown number calling. She let it ring. When she checked her voicemail afterward, it was Adrian's voice, low, unhurried, carrying the particular texture of a man who was choosing his words the way other men chose their weapons. "I'd like to speak with you. Tonight. The Black Orchid, 7 o'clock through the front entrance. As a guest, not staff." She listened to it twice. Then she called back. He picked up on the second ring. "7 is fine," she said. "Good." A pause. "Do you need anything, transportation or—" "I'll find my own way," she said. "I always do." She hung up. The woman at the counter waiting for her coffee looked up at her curiously. Elena set the coffee down, smiled in the way that meant nothing but goodwill, and went to take another order. She arrived at 7:02. The hostess at the front entrance was a woman Elena had nodded to 100 times from the other side of the service relationship. Tonight, the woman looked at her with visible confusion, the same confusion people always showed when someone they'd categorized firmly in one role appeared without warning in another. "Ms. Moretti," the hostess said, "Mr. Valenti is expecting you. I'll take you through." The room felt different from the front entrance. She had walked the service routes of the Black Orchid so many times that her feet knew the floor by instinct. But this path through the main dining area between the tables she normally navigated from the other side had a different quality. She was aware of eyes following her. Not many. The Tuesday evening crowd was sparse. But the ones who were there recognized her, or recognized the story that was already moving through Adrian's world about the Friday that no one was quite sure how to categorize yet. Adrian was at a corner table. He stood when she reached it. She registered that. Filed it without reaction. They sat. A server appeared, not anyone she knew from the Friday crew, and poured water and offered menus, and withdrew in the practiced way that good service required. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Adrian looked at her with the same quality of attention he had given her across the bar on Friday night. Like he was reading something in a language he mostly knew, but had encountered a dialect of that required extra care. "You're not nervous," he said. "Should I be? Most people who sit across this table from me are nervous." "I've noticed," she said. "It doesn't seem to produce better outcomes for them." Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, something adjacent to respect. "I want to know who you are," he said, "and I want you to tell me yourself." She looked at him evenly. "You've already had people looking," she said. "Yes." "How far did they get?" "Far enough to know the name you're using isn't the name you were born with. Far enough to know why." She folded her hands on the table. The moment had the particular quality of a door, something that once she walked through it would change the space on the other side in ways she could prepare for, but not fully predict. She said, "What did they tell you about Meridian Capital?" His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did the sharpening that happened when a man who was very good at gathering information found that someone across the table from him already knew exactly where his information ended. "Tell me your version first," he said. She did. Not everything. She was not going to give everything to a man she'd spoken to 4 times, regardless of how clearly she'd read him, and regardless of the fact that her read told her he was, by the particular moral standards of his specific world, more reliable than many people she had encountered in supposedly legitimate ones. She told him the structure of it, the financial trails she had found at Meridian, the scale of what they indicated, not ordinary corporate fraud, not the corner-cutting and creative accounting that was endemic to that world, but the systematic movement of money that connected the firm's upper management to people and operations that operated significantly outside the law. She told him what had happened when she filed the internal report. The 72 hours after that compressed into a few precise sentences, the content of which required no emotional embellishment, because the facts themselves were sufficient. She told him she had disappeared. She told him she had rebuilt. She did not tell him about the 3 people in the Meridian network who had died in the past 18 months, or about the specific nature of her connection to those deaths, or about the remaining names on the list she was working through. When she finished, Adrian was quiet. He turned his water glass slowly on the table, the way she had turned hers the night before. "Some of those names," he said finally. "The people above the firm's official level. Yes, are names I know. I know you know them." The air in the room changed. Adrian looked at her, really looked at her with the specific attention of a man recalculating distances. "You took a job in my club," he said slowly. "Yes. Because they come here. Some of them, on Fridays. For 11 months. For 11 months. He sat back in his chair. He said nothing for a long time. Elena let him be silent. She was good at silence. She had learned it in the same period she had learned everything else she needed to survive. That silence was not absence. It was presence of a different kind. and that the person who could be comfortable in it while another person worked through something difficult was usually the person with more actual control of the situation. "The Friday night fight," Adrian said, accepting the challenge. "You did that to change what story was being told about you in this room." "Partly." "What's the other part?" She met his eyes. "I needed you to see me," she said. "Not the waitress. Me." Another silence. "Why?" he said. But his voice had changed. Lower. The word was not a tactical question anymore. It was something more genuine than that. "Because I can't finish what I started without help," she said. "And the only person in this city with the reach to help me is you." She said it plainly, without performance, without the softening qualifiers that people used when they wanted to make a difficult truth more palatable. She had made a calculation. The calculation was him, and she had spent 11 months verifying it before she trusted it enough to act on it. Adrian Valenti looked at the woman across the table from him, and for a moment he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The specific disorientation of someone who had believed they understood a situation completely and had just discovered an entire second layer underneath the one they'd been reading. "You were never just hiding," he said. "No. You were positioning. Hiding and positioning aren't mutually exclusive. For 3 years. For 3 years." He stood up, walked to the window, stood there looking out at nothing in particular for 15 seconds. Then he came back to the table and sat down again, and when he looked at her this time, there was something different in his face, something that was not quite admiration, and was not quite suspicion, and existed in the interesting space between the two. "The people from the Meridian list who've died," he said, "in the past year and a half." She didn't answer. "Were those accidents?" he said. "Some of them were," she said carefully. "And the others, she said, were the natural consequence of what happens when people who tried very hard to erase someone discover that the erasure didn't take." The silence that followed had weight. Adrian looked at his hands on the table. "You're not who I thought you were," he said. "Nobody in this room," she replied quietly, "is who they appear to be. That's not unique to me." He almost smiled at that. Almost. "The public statement I made on Friday," he said. "Yes. In my world, that can't be undone. I know. It creates a situation that requires resolution. I know that too." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm going to ask you a direct question." "All right. Did you plan for that to happen?" She held his gaze. "I planned for you to notice me," she said. "I did not plan for the specific way you chose to notice me. That was yours." He absorbed this. "But when it happened," he said, "when I made that statement, you didn't walk away." "No." "Why not?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because a shield changes the math." He understood what she meant. She could see that he understood exactly what she meant, because the expression on his face shifted the calculation in it, the assessment of what she was proposing with those 4 words, the recognition of what it would mean for both of them. "A marriage of convenience," he said. "A strategic alliance," she said, "dressed as a marriage of convenience, which is a thing you understand better than most people. What would you need from it? Protection, information access, the ability to move in rooms that require your name behind me, and someone who doesn't try to tell me what to do with what I find. And what do I get?" She looked at him steadily. "You get the truth about every person in your organization who is also on the Meridian list," she said. "And there are more than you think." That landed. She watched it land. His jaw tightened. Not in anger, in the particular expression of a man receiving information that confirms something he had been half aware of but hadn't wanted to fully look at. "How many?" he said. "I'll tell you after we have an agreement," she said. "Not before." He looked at her. "You're negotiating with me." "Yes. In my restaurant. It seemed like the appropriate venue." And this time, the thing in his expression resolved clearly enough that she could name it. It was respect. Not the kind that came from fear or performance. The kind that came from encountering something that was genuinely unexpectedly equal to you in a way you hadn't anticipated. "Separate rooms," he said, slowly. "Testing." "Separate rooms," she confirmed. "You'll have access to whatever information you need within what I control. I won't restrict it, and I won't ask you to report to me." "Agreed." "Your family. You have family." She didn't answer immediately. "A sister," she said finally. "In Portland. She doesn't know I'm alive." Something moved across his face at that. Fast. Almost too fast to read. "She'll be protected," he said. "Fully." Elena looked at him. The directness of it. The fact that he had moved immediately to the sister without needing to be asked, without using it as a bargaining point, told her something about him that she had suspected and not confirmed. "One more condition," she said. "Tell me. Never treat me like property." He didn't blink. "Done," he said, without hesitation. They looked at each other across the table. "Mr. Valenti," she said. "Adrian." "Adrian." She said it once, testing the weight of it. "Do we have an agreement?" He extended his hand across the table. She took it. His grip was firm and direct and lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "We have an agreement," he said. Vincent found out the next morning. He stood in Adrian's office with the expression of a man who had been with his employer through 12 years of decisions he wouldn't have personally made, and had learned that his role was to execute, not to evaluate. "The wedding," Adrian said. "Keep it private. No press, no ceremony beyond what's legally required. I want it done within the week." "Within the week," Vincent repeated. "There are people in my network who will see this as a weakness," Adrian said. "A woman they don't know appearing from nowhere, the fight, the public statement. The longer the gap between the statement and the formalization, the more space there is for interpretation." "And the woman herself," Vincent said carefully. "You've investigated her background. You know what she is." "I know what she was," Adrian said. "And I know what she's been for the past 3 years. She's not who she's presenting as." "No," Adrian agreed. "She's considerably more than that." Vincent looked at him. "Sir?" "She knows about the Meridian connections," Adrian said. "To people inside my organization." Vincent went very still. "How many?" He said. "I don't know yet. She does." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man who had been loyal to another man for 12 years, recalibrating every assumption he had made about the preceding 12 months. "You trust her?" Vincent said. "Not a question." "I trust the logic of her position," Adrian said. "She needs me for what she's building toward. I need what she knows. The trust is structural." "And if it becomes more than structural?" Adrian looked at him. "That's not a question I'm going to answer." Vincent nodded and left. Adrian turned to his window. He was already thinking about names. The ones he knew were connected to Meridian through his own experience, the ones he suspected, the ones he hadn't considered, because they were close enough to him that the consideration itself was something his instincts had refused. Elena Catherine had told him there were more than he thought. She had said it the way someone said a thing when they had already counted carefully. He picked up his phone. He put it down. He went to a cabinet, unlocked it, took out a file he had kept for 3 years about the Meridian situation, not because he had been directly involved, but because powerful men who were not directly involved in things that other powerful men were doing still paid attention to those things because attention was how you survived, and he opened it on his desk and started reading it differently than he had read it before. Looking for the names she would tell him, trying to find them before she did. He found 2 in 40 minutes. The cold that moved through him was not fear. It was the specific cold of a man who had trusted certain people with certain things and was now understanding that the trust had been at least partially a weapon used against him. He closed the file. "All right, Catherine Sorel," he said quietly to the room, to the city outside his window, to the woman who had spent 11 months learning everything about his world from the inside out. Show me the rest. The wedding happened on a Thursday. A judge, a private office, 2 witnesses. Vincent for Adrian, a woman named Rosa, who worked in the Black Orchid's accounting department, and who Elena had assessed over 11 months as both trustworthy and discreet. No flowers, no celebration, no champagne toasts. Elena wore a dark green dress she had bought that morning. Adrian wore a suit he would have worn to any other Thursday meeting. The judge read the required language, and they said the required words, and signed the required documents. And when it was finished, Elena looked at the marriage certificate in a way that lasted 2 seconds before she folded it and placed it in her bag. Rosa, to her considerable credit, did not say anything sentimental. Vincent, to no one's surprise, said nothing at all. In the car afterward, Elena and Adrian sat without talking for a block and a half. Then Elena said, "There are 4 names in your inner organization." Adrian didn't look at her. He looked at the traffic ahead. "Tell me," he said. She told him. The first name, a man who handled the financial routing for 3 of Adrian's legitimate businesses, produced no visible reaction. The second, a woman who had been in Adrian's legal advisory team for 4 years, produced a brief controlled exhale. The third made Adrian's hand, resting on his knee, tighten into a stillness that was worse than a fist. The fourth name made him turn and look at her for the first time since she'd started speaking. His face was very controlled. "You're certain," he said. "I spent 11 months being certain," she said. He turned back to the window. She could see the line of his jaw working. The specific tension of a man processing something that he had not allowed himself to see, and now was seeing and could not unsee. The fourth name was someone he had known for 9 years. Someone he had trusted with things he hadn't trusted to anyone else. Someone who it now appeared had been passing information about his operation to the people behind the Meridian network for at least the past 2 of those 9 years. "How?" he said, very quiet. "Money initially," Elena said. "Then something more effective than money. Leverage. Information about a family member. I have the details when you're ready for them." "Not yet," he said. "Okay." "Not yet," he said again, more quietly. She let him have the space. The car moved through the city. Outside, people walked with their coats pulled close against the November cold, moving through their Thursday, with whatever Thursday was carrying for each of them. None of them could see into the car. None of them knew that inside it, a man who controlled a significant portion of what moved invisibly through this city was sitting with the specific weight of profound, calculated betrayal. And the woman beside him had placed that weight in his hands deliberately, because she had determined he was strong enough to hold it and do something useful with it. After a while, Elena said, "I'm sorry about the fourth one." He looked at her. She said it plainly, without elaboration. Just acknowledged the specific human weight of it, that some information was not just information, that some revelations cost something that couldn't be fully categorized as strategy. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "How did you know it would hit differently?" "Because I know which relationships you protect," she said. 11 months of observation. He looked back at the window. "You know a great deal about me," he said. "I know what's visible in the way you run things," she said. "How you treat the people who've been with you a long time versus the people who are new, where your patience comes from and where it runs out. How you talk to the staff when you think no one senior is paying attention." He turned to look at her again. "And what did you conclude?" he said. The question was not casual. It was the question of a man who had spent years being read incorrectly, as pure power, as pure threat, as a function of what he controlled, rather than as a person who existed beneath the structure, and who, for reasons he might not have been able to fully explain, wanted to know what this specific woman had seen. Elena looked at him steadily. "I concluded," she said, "that you are significantly more than what most people in your world are allowed to see." The car stopped at a light. Neither of them spoke until it changed. Jim. The news moved through Adrian's network the way significant news always moved faster than he would have preferred, and less accurately than the truth warranted. By Friday evening, the people who needed to know that Adrian Valenti had married the woman from the fight knew. The people who didn't yet know had begun to hear pieces of it distorted by the telephone game quality of information moving through circles where everyone had an interest in the version that served them best. The reactions divided along predictable lines. The people who feared Adrian most were cautious. They reserved judgment. They watched. The people who envied Adrian, who had spent years managing their resentment of his position and his reach with the patient discipline of men who knew that acting on that resentment too early was a death sentence, saw a possible opening. A man who had made an impulsive public statement and formalized it was a man who had made a decision driven by something other than pure calculation. And decisions driven by something other than pure calculation were the kind that sometimes created vulnerabilities. A man named Raymond Gallo decided that this was information worth acting on. Raymond Gallo was 53 years old and had been navigating the edge of Adrian's sphere for the better part of a decade, never inside it, never far enough outside it to be irrelevant, occupying the particular position of a man who was substantial enough not to be ignored and not substantial enough to be absorbed. He operated 3 businesses, and the revenue from 2 of them was legitimate, and the revenue from the third one was complicated, and the complicated one had over the past 2 years begun to benefit from connections within the Meridian network. His name was not on Elena's list, but 3 people on Elena's list reported to him. He called someone he trusted on a Saturday morning and said, "I want to know everything about the woman." What he got back over the following 48 hours was incomplete, which he knew, and alarming, which he hadn't expected. The incomplete part was the surface information: the identity, the months at the Black Orchid, the fight, the sudden marriage. All of that had the quality of a constructed story, and he was experienced enough to recognize the difference between a life that had been lived and a narrative that had been assembled. The alarming part was what was underneath. 3 people in the Meridian network had died in the past 18 months. Raymond Gallo was not a sentimental man, and dead people in the criminal world were not unusual, and he would not ordinarily have connected 3 separate deaths to a single cause. But he was a man who paid attention to patterns, and the pattern he was looking at, now the timing, the specific people involved, the fact that they were all connected to a decision that had been made 3 years ago about a financial investigator who had seen too much produced a conclusion he didn't like. She was still active. The investigator they had signed off on eliminating 3 years ago had not been eliminated. She had been waiting. He sat with this for 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon. Then he made a phone call. "The Valenti situation," he said when the line connected. "We have a problem." Elena felt the change before she could have explained what specifically had changed. It was Sunday. She was in the office space. Adrian had given her a room on the 2nd floor of the building that housed his legitimate operations, with a desk and a computer system and access to the financial records she had requested and received without the interrogation she had expected. She was building a map, not a literal map, a relational one. The network of connections between the Meridian people and the money flows and the specific transactions that documented how the laundering had worked and who had received what and when and from where. She had been building this map for 3 years in pieces, carrying it in her head and in coded files on devices she kept physically separate from anything connected to her daily life. Now, for the first time, she had resources that let her build it properly. She was deep in a sequence of transaction records when she became aware of the change. It was small. The quality of the building's silence. The way the sounds from the street below had a slightly different texture than they'd had an hour ago. Not louder, not more numerous, but differently distributed. Someone was paying attention to this building, not conducting surveillance in the obvious way that could be detected from a window. In a more diffuse way. The kind of attention that spread itself thin across multiple observation points, so that no single one was obvious. She saved her work, closed the computer. She walked out of the office and down the hall to where Adrian was in a meeting with Vincent and two other men she had identified as part of his legitimate business operations. She opened the door. 4 men looked at her. She looked at Adrian. "We need to talk," she said. "Now." He read her face for exactly 1 second and then said to the room, "Give us a moment." When they were alone, she said, "Someone knows I'm not dead." He went still. "How sure are you?" he said. "Sure enough to tell you on a Sunday." He moved to his desk, picked up his phone, punched in a number. "Vincent," he said when it connected. "External surveillance on this building. How quickly can you confirm?" The answer came back fast. 2 minutes later, Vincent was in the doorway. "3 vehicles," he said, "on rotating positions, consistent with professional surveillance. They started this morning." Adrian looked at Elena. Elena looked at the window. "Raymond Gallo," she said. Vincent's expression shifted. "You know Gallo," he said. "I know 3 people who report to him," she said. "And I know that 2 of the 3 Meridian deaths he would have been notified about directly." She looked at Adrian. "He would have recognized the pattern. He's faster than the others." "And he's moved faster than I expected," Adrian said. He said it without visible stress, like a problem that had arrived slightly ahead of schedule but was not outside the range of planning. He looked at her. "Are you in danger?" She met his eyes. "We both are," she said. "That's different." He held her gaze. "How do we move?" he said. She had been thinking about this since she closed the computer, since the moment the quality of the street noise changed and her body had registered the shift before her mind had named it. "We give him less than he came for," she said. "He expects me to run or hide. That's what the profile he has on me suggests I would do. I've been hiding for 3 years, it's a reasonable assumption. And instead," Adrian said. She sat down in the chair across from his desk. She crossed her hands in her lap. "Instead," she said, "we invite him to dinner." Vincent made a sound. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly he sat down too. "Explain," he said, and she did. As she talked, she watched his face move through the stages of following a logic that was not his, not the logic of force or threat or positional power, but something more lateral, something that operated in the space between what people expected and what they received. She watched him reach the point where the logic resolved, and the expression on his face became the expression of a man who was genuinely unexpectedly engaged by another mind. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've done this before." "Yes," she said, "successfully." She looked at him. "I'm still here," she said. He picked up his phone. He called Raymond Gallo. He invited him to dinner on Wednesday. His voice was warm and easy and entirely natural, the voice of a man calling a business associate for a social occasion, with nothing in it that suggested the call had been made from the same room as the woman Raymond Gallo was currently having surveilled. When he hung up, he set the phone down. He looked at Elena. "Wednesday," he said. "Wednesday," she confirmed. She stood, started toward the door. "Elena," he said. She stopped. "Catherine," he said. Quiet. Testing whether she'd respond to it. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his most unguarded one, the face he wore when the performance of control had been allowed to drop for the space of a moment. "The people who tried to erase you," he said. 3 years of this, building toward it." He paused. "Were you ever afraid it wouldn't work?" She looked at him for a long time. "Every day," she said. She said it without performance. Just the clean, honest weight of it, the 3 years of mornings waking up in a name that wasn't hers, in a life she had built like a shelter from materials she'd found rather than chosen, carrying something that was too important to put down and too heavy to carry forever. "Every day." He nodded. "Wednesday," she said. "I'll need you to trust me when the moment comes." She didn't wait for his answer. She walked out. Adrian sat alone in his office for a long time after she left, listening to the particular silence of a building where something was shifting under the surface of the ordinary, and thinking about a woman who had survived 3 years of alone and arrived in his world like a question he was only beginning to understand how to answer. Outside Raymond Gallo's surveillance vehicles rotated their positions. Wednesday was coming, and Elena Moretti, the woman who had walked into a room full of powerful men with nothing but a waitress apron, and the specific, quietly terrifying competence of someone who had already decided the outcome was already 17 moves ahead. Wednesday arrived the way danger always arrived in Elena's experience, with the surface appearance of an ordinary day and a texture underneath it that was anything but. She spent the morning in the office on the second floor, going through the last section of the financial map she had been building. The records Adrian had given her access to filled in 3 gaps she had been working around for over a year: transaction routes she had traced to their edges and lost connections she had suspected but couldn't document. Now she had documentation. She printed nothing. She kept everything in a coded structure that lived in a system she had built herself on a device Adrian's IT people had not touched, which she had explained to him, and which he had accepted without argument in the way that she was beginning to understand, was characteristic of him when he trusted the logic of a position, even if he didn't fully understand its technical details. She closed the laptop at 11:30. She sat for a moment in the quiet. Then she said to no one very quietly, 3 more after tonight. 3 names left on the list that had existed in her head since the night she stood in her apartment in a life that no longer existed, and understood with complete clarity that the people who had tried to erase her were not going to stop trying, and that the only viable response to that was not to run forever, but to reduce the list until there was nothing left to run from. Raymond Gallo was not on the list, but 3 people who reported to him were, and Raymond Gallo, by moving first and moving fast, had made himself a different kind of problem, the kind that had to be resolved before the list could be finished, because a man who understood what she was doing and had the reach to act on that understanding was a threat of a different order than the names she'd already worked through. She went downstairs. Adrian was in the main dining room with Vincent and the 2 men from Sunday's interrupted meeting. She could hear voices through the closed door, the particular cadence of planning which had a rhythm you could recognize even without making out specific words. She didn't interrupt. She went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the counter drinking it, and after 7 minutes, Adrian came through the door and stopped when he saw her. "How are you feeling?" he said. She looked at him. "I don't feel things on days like this," she said. "I think." He poured coffee for himself. "And what are you thinking?" "That Raymond Gallo is going to come tonight having already decided he's in control of the situation. He's older than you by 9 years. He's been operating in this world longer. He's seen men like you make decisions he considered impulsive before, and he's watched those decisions become liabilities." She drank her coffee. "He thinks the marriage is the impulse. He thinks I'm the liability. And you're going to show him otherwise." "We're going to show him otherwise," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her over his coffee cup. "Tell me what you need from me tonight," he said. "Be exactly who you are," she said. "Don't perform more than usual. Don't over-explain. Don't make me the subject of the evening. Let him bring me into it because he will, and when he does, follow my lead." "Follow your lead," he repeated. Flat. Testing whether she'd catch the particular quality of a man who did not follow other people's leads, being asked to do exactly that. She caught it. "I understand that's not your default position," she said. "But tonight the play is mine. I've been building it for longer than you've known I exist." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Just that. No qualification. No negotiation." She studied him, the directness of it, the absence of the ego resistance she had expected, and filed it alongside everything else she was building about who Adrian Valenti actually was beneath the structure of what he controlled. "Thank you," she said, simply. He nodded and left to finish his meeting. She stood at the counter and finished her coffee and thought about the evening the way a chess player thought about a position, not move by move, in linear sequence, but spatially all at once, the whole shape of what could happen and where each variation led, and which of those variations she could live with and which she couldn't. She had done this before. The difference tonight was that there was someone else on her side of the board. She wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. Raymond Gallo arrived at 8 o'clock with two men she identified as protection, not ostentatious, not threatening the professional, invisible kind that said money and caution without saying fear. He was a thick man, not tall, with the kind of face that had started as ordinary and been pressed by years of specific experience into something harder and more strategic. He shook Adrian's hand with the easy confidence of a man who had been shaking the hands of men like Adrian for 30 years and found them consistently legible. He looked at Elena when Adrian introduced her. "Congratulations," he said. "I heard about the fight. I'm sorry I missed it." "There will be others," Elena said pleasantly. Something moved in his eyes. Fast. Gone. They sat. The dinner was good. Adrian ran a kitchen with the same attention to quality he gave everything else, and the food arrived in the unhurried sequence of a meal designed to fill time without calling attention to itself. The conversation in the first 40 minutes was the surface conversation of men who had known each other at a distance for years and had particular things they were navigating toward through the medium of talk about other things. Sports. A real estate development in the financial district that both of them had interests adjacent to. A mutual acquaintance who had recently retired to Florida with the specific haste that in their world meant something other than a desire for warm weather. Elena ate. She listened. She contributed the occasional light comment at intervals calculated to confirm that she was engaged without positioning herself as significant. She was building a read of Raymond Gallo that she was overlaying on the existing read she'd built from 3 years of studying the people in his network. He was sharper than she'd expected in person. That was not alarming. It was useful information. Sharper men made more interesting mistakes. At the 45-minute mark, Raymond set down his fork and looked at Elena in the direct way that said the surface portion of the evening had run its course, and he had decided to shift into the layer underneath. "Adrian tells me you were working in the service industry before," he said. The phrasing was precise, not rude, just precisely calibrated to establish relative position. "For about a year," she said. "After a career change." "What was the career before?" "Financial investigation," she said, easily, without hesitation. She felt rather than saw Adrian's stillness beside her. He had not known she would say this directly. But she had decided on the drive over that the specific move here was to hand Raymond a portion of the truth before he could use not having it as a tool, because a man who discovered you were hiding something always assumed what he discovered was the whole thing, while a man who received a partial truth voluntarily recalibrated his read, and in doing so often revealed more about his own position than he intended. Raymond's expression didn't change, but his hand resting beside his wine glass moved 3 millimeters. "Interesting career," he said. "It was," she agreed. "Until it became dangerous. Career changes have a way of following from that." "What kind of dangerous?" he said. "The kind where people who have something to protect decide that the person asking questions would be better off not asking them." She looked at him pleasantly. "I imagine you're familiar with that dynamic." "Everyone in business is familiar with it to some degree," he said. "Of course," she agreed. "The degree is the variable." Another silence, shorter this time. Raymond picked up his wine, drank, set it down. "You've built something impressive," he said to Adrian. "But new additions to an established structure always carry adjustment costs." "Elena is not an adjustment cost," Adrian said. His voice was easy, flat, the particular tone of a man stating a fact rather than defending a position. Raymond smiled. "I only mean that new relationships bring new exposure. It's the nature of things, nothing personal toward—" He looked at Elena again. "Toward your wife." The word wife landed with the slight extra weight of a man who found it mildly implausible. Elena picked up her own wine. "Mr. Gallo," she said. Can I ask you something directly? He opened his hand. An invitation. The three businesses you operate: the logistics company, the import firm, and the private security consultation. The consultation business has had an interesting growth pattern in the past 2 years. Raymond Gallo went completely still. Elena continued as if she hadn't noticed. Specifically, the consultation clients in the second year overlap quite significantly with a network of financial interests that had some difficulty around a corporate fraud investigation. I find that kind of pattern interesting from a purely analytical perspective. She set down her wine. Old habits. The table was very quiet. Adrian had not moved. Raymond looked at Elena with an expression that had lost its social surface and revealed beneath it the face of a man who was rapidly recalculating the distance between where he thought he was and where he actually was. "That's very specific knowledge," he said. His voice was still controlled, still even. But the quality of it had changed in the way that voices change when the person using them is managing something larger than the words. "I told you," she said. "Financial investigation. The analytical habit doesn't switch off." "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything," she said. "I'm telling you what I know, because I think men in your position make better decisions when they're operating with accurate information." She looked at him directly. "I know about the consultation clients," she said. "I know about the 3 people in your network who were part of the Meridian decision 3 years ago. I know about the routing structure they used, and I have documented evidence of all of it. And I know that you've had surveillance on this building since Sunday, which means you know that I know, which means we've both been spending this dinner pretending we're having a different conversation than the one we're actually having." Raymond Gallo put both hands on the table. He looked at Adrian. "You knew she would do this," he said. "I knew she would handle it," Adrian said. "There's a difference." Gallo looked back at Elena. Something in his face had shifted into a territory she recognized. Not anger, not fear, but the very specific expression of a man who had operated for 30 years on the assumption that he was the most comprehensively informed person in any room he entered, confronting evidence that tonight was not that room. "What do you want?" he said. The directness was its own concession. "I want the 3 people in your network to stop what they're doing," she said. "And I want you to facilitate that. Not reluctantly, not after negotiation, but as a straightforward business decision made by a man who understands the alternative." "And the evidence you mentioned?" "Exists," she said, "and will continue to exist. You don't get the evidence. That's not part of this." "Then I have no guarantee. You have my word," she said. "And you have his." She indicated Adrian without looking at him. "In the world you operate in, that should be a sufficient guarantee." Raymond looked at Adrian. Adrian looked back at him with the expression of a man who was waiting to see whether Raymond Gallo was going to make a good decision or a bad one, and who had no particular emotional investment in which it turned out to be, but who had a very clear understanding of what would follow from each. The silence lasted 9 seconds. Elena counted them. "All right," Raymond said. He said it the way a man said something when he had finished calculating and found that the calculation had only one viable output. Not graceful, not conceding, just factual. "All right," she said. She picked up her fork. She finished her dinner. Raymond Gallo left at 10:15 with his 2 protection men and the particular posture of a man who had come to an evening expecting to collect information and was leaving, having deposited it instead. Elena watched the car leave from the window. Adrian came to stand beside her. 3 people in his network," he said. "They'll be dealt with by the end of the week." "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You gave him nothing," he said. "I gave him enough to make the right decision." "And if he'd made the wrong one?" "Then we'd be having a different conversation right now," she said. "And it would be shorter and less pleasant." He turned to look at her. "You were never uncertain about how that would go," he said. She turned from the window. "I was uncertain," she said. "I just didn't show it." He looked at her. "Why not?" Because in a room like that, the first person to show uncertainty loses the frame of the conversation, she said. Even if the uncertainty is legitimate, even if it's reasonable. The frame matters more than the content in the first 15 minutes. After that, the content takes over. Where did you learn that? She was quiet for a moment. A man I worked with at the first federal agency, she said. He was 62 years old and had spent 30 years in rooms where the wrong word at the wrong moment cost lives. He told me the most expensive thing you can give away for free is the impression that you're guessing. Adrian absorbed this. Was he good at it? He said. Not guessing. He was exceptional, she said. He was also exhausted by 45. The cost of that kind of control is high. She paused. He told me that too. They stood for a moment in the quiet of the room. 3 more names on your list, Adrian said. Not a question. She looked at him. Vincent told you, she said. Vincent tells me things, he said without apology. 3 more. Yes. After tonight, Raymond Gallo's network withdraws from those 3 people. That changes what they have available to them. Yes, she said. It isolates them. You planned for that too. She didn't answer because the answer was obvious. He looked at the window where Raymond Gallo's car was long gone. I want to help with the 3, he said. She turned to look at him. He met her eyes. Not to take over, he said before she could respond. Not to manage it or redirect it. What you're doing is yours. I understand that. He paused. But you've been alone in this for 3 years, and you don't have to be alone in it anymore. The simplicity of it caught her off guard. Not the offer itself she had been building toward, needing exactly this kind of support when she entered the Black Orchid 11 months ago, so the offer was part of a plan she had made. But the way he made it, without transaction, without the implicit accounting of what he would receive in return. Just the direct statement of a man who had decided something and was saying it. She was quiet for long enough that it became a different kind of quiet. One of the 3 is in this city, she said finally. He moves frequently. He's been harder to track than the others because his schedule is deliberately irregular. Name, Adrian said. Daniel Rice. He runs a private equity structure that was the primary vehicle for the Meridian laundering. The money that was used to fund the operation that tried to eliminate me, it moved through his accounts. Adrian nodded. I know Daniel Rice, he said. She looked at him sharply. Not well, he said. We've been in the same rooms twice. He's cautious, smart. The kind of man who manages his exposure very carefully. He does, she agreed. He's the most careful of the remaining 3. Which is why he's last, Adrian said. She looked at him. No, she said. He's last because I need what he knows before he stops being available to provide it. Daniel Rice has documentation, actual physical documentation, that I've never been able to access that would complete the evidentiary picture. Without it, what I have is sufficient to destroy careers, but not sufficient to result in criminal prosecution. You want prosecution? He said. Not surprised, just confirming. I want them in front of a judge, she said. I want the record to exist, not just the consequence the record. He was quiet. That's different from what I assumed you were building toward, he said. What did you assume? He looked at her honestly. That you were building toward something more final. She held his gaze. Some of them, yes, she said. The ones who made the operational decision to come after me personally, who knew exactly what they were authorizing, those required a different kind of resolution. She paused. The ones who were participants rather than architects, those I want in front of a court. Rice is an architect. Rice is the architect, she said. The financial structure was his design. The whole thing exists because of what he built. Without him, none of the rest of it had the infrastructure to function. And you want him in front of a judge. I want him in front of a judge, she confirmed. With documentation. In public. With his name on a charging document that doesn't disappear because he's paid the right people to make it disappear. She said it with a contained intensity that was the first fully unguarded thing he had heard from her. Not anger, it was too controlled for anger. Something older than anger. The specific feeling of a person who had watched justice fail in real time and had spent 3 years building an alternate route to something that resembled it. Adrian looked at her for a long time. "All right," he said. "How do we get to Rice?" What neither of them knew, what no one in Adrian's organization had yet detected, was that Raymond Gallo, driving away from dinner on Wednesday night, had made a phone call. Not to the 3 people in his network that Elena had identified. Not to a lawyer or a financial contact, or anyone connected to the Meridian structure. He called a man named Carl Whitfield. Carl Whitfield was 61 years old and had been the senior partner at a political consulting firm in Washington, D.C. for the past 18 years. Before that, he had spent 11 years in a federal agency, not as an investigator, but in the specific tier above investigators, where decisions were made about which investigations continued and which ones were quietly closed, and which investigators found themselves facing unexpected professional difficulties that redirected their careers. He had been part of the Meridian decision 3 years ago. Not operationally. He had not made phone calls or authorized actions. He had simply, in 2 brief conversations with the right people at the right time, communicated that a particular investigation would be inconvenient for people he had relationships with, and that its continuation would be difficult to support, and that perhaps certain measures might be considered appropriate. He had never expected to hear about it again. When Raymond Gallo told him what had happened at dinner, the specific information, the woman had demonstrated knowledge of the calm with which she had deployed it. The conclusion that Catherine Sorrell was not only alive, but had spent 3 years building something. Carl Whitfield was quiet on the phone for a very long time. Then he said, "How much does she have?" "Enough," Raymond said. "Possibly everything." "And Valenti is behind her." "In front of her, from what I can tell," Raymond said. "Which is the more concerning configuration." Whitfield said nothing for another moment. "This needs to be resolved," he said. "I came to the same conclusion," Raymond said. "I'm calling because 3 years ago you told me the people you used were the best available. I need to know if they're still available." Whitfield considered this. "It would look very bad," he said. "Given the circumstances, given who she's married to, it would look considerably worse," Raymond said evenly, "if a federal prosecutor gets access to the documentation she appears to have." Another silence. "Give me 24 hours, Whitfield said. He hung up. In his office in Washington, with the particular quiet of a man who had spent his career managing the distance between what happened and what was recorded as having happened. Carl Whitfield looked at his desk and understood with cold clarity that the situation had developed past the point where it could be managed from the periphery. Catherine Sorrell needed to stop. He picked up a different phone. He called someone he had not called in 3 years. Elena didn't sleep well on Wednesday night. Not because of fear. She had told Adrian truthfully that fear was something she processed differently, and she had meant it. But the dinner had dislodged something that she was having difficulty relocating. Something in the territory of relief which she distrusted, because relief was the emotional state that made people lower their guard. And she was not in a position to lower her guard until she was finished. She lay awake in the bedroom Adrian had given her, large, quiet, with a view. She kept the blinds closed on because she didn't like the exposure, and went through the remaining steps of what she was building. 3 names. Rice was the priority, but there were 2 others. A woman named Sandra Cho, who had been the legal architect of the corporate structure that housed the laundering, and a man named Philip Marsh, who had managed the operational communications, and whose records she knew included the specific documentation of what had been authorized regarding her elimination. Sandra Cho was in New York. Philip Marsh was in Chicago. Reese moved between 3 cities and had a pattern she'd been tracking for 8 months that suggested he spent the last week of every month in New York for a series of meetings at a private club in Midtown. The last week of November began in 5 days. She had 5 days. She was running the timeline in her head for the 4th time when her phone showed a text from a number she had established as a monitoring notification, an alert from a system she maintained that tracked specific digital markers connected to the Meridian network. One of the markers had activated. She sat up. She looked at the notification for 10 seconds. Then she got out of bed and went down the hall and knocked on Adrian's door. He opened it in 30 seconds, already awake by the sound of his voice when he said, "What is it?" "Someone made contact with a person I've been monitoring," she said. "Someone senior. The kind of contact that gets made when a decision about a response has been taken." He stepped into the hall, pulling the door mostly closed behind him. "A response to tonight," he said. "A response to the information I demonstrated I had," she said. "Tonight accelerated something. I expected it to come from Gallo, but this didn't come from Gallo." "Who?" "Someone above Gallo in the original structure. Someone who was never part of the operational layer. He was insulation. He gave directives through 2 removes. His direct contact to the network has been dormant for 3 years. And now it's active." "Now it's active," she said. She could see him processing this in real time, the specific quality of his attention when he was assessing something, the way his eyes went slightly still. "We moved too fast," he said, not accusatory, just calculating. "We moved exactly as fast as we needed to," she said. "But we've triggered a response from someone I didn't have enough information about. Someone whose resources I can't fully estimate." He looked at her. "We need to move Rice up," she said. "Whatever the timeline was for the last week of November, it needs to be now, before whoever made this contact tonight has time to put something in motion." "Rice," he said slowly. "You said he's the most careful." "He is. Getting to careful people quickly usually requires them to be less careful than they want to be. Which requires pressure," she said. "What kind of pressure?" She looked at him in the dim hallway. "His investment fund has a major capital event in 9 days," she said. "A significant withdrawal that he's been managing very delicately. If that withdrawal were complicated by the sudden appearance of questions about his fund's compliance history, he would need to move quickly to address it. He'd have to surface. He'd have to make himself accessible to people he normally insulates himself from." "You want to create a financial pressure event. I want to introduce a document into the right channels," she said. "A document that raises legitimate questions about the fund's structure, which is not fabrication. The questions are legitimate. I've just been waiting for the right moment to ask them." 9 days is tight." I know someone at the Securities Commission," he said. It was the first time he had offered a direct resource rather than a logistical one. He said it with the particular neutrality of a man who understood that what he was offering was legally complicated and had decided that didn't outweigh the need. Elena looked at him. "That would accelerate the timeline," she said. "Yes." "By how much?" "If I make the call tomorrow, 3 days. Maybe 2. 2 days," she calculated. "Do it," she said. He nodded. She started back toward her room. "Elena." She stopped. "The person who made contact tonight," he said. "The senior one. You said you don't have enough information about his resources." "Not yet," she said. "Are you telling me you can't estimate the threat level?" She turned. She looked at him honestly, fully, without the managed presentation she gave to almost every piece of information she delivered. "I'm telling you, this is the first moment in 3 years where I don't have a complete read on the next move," she said. "And I want you to know that before tomorrow." He held her gaze. "Thank you for telling me," he said, quietly. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "We still win this." "I know," he said. "I just want you to know the ground we're standing on." "I know the ground," he said. "I've built things on worse." She almost smiled. It didn't quite get there. She went back to her room. She did not sleep. But she lay down and let her mind work through it, the timeline, the resources, the things she knew and the things she was estimating, and the gap between them. And at some point before dawn, the working became something quieter, and she was still. and the city outside the closed blinds kept moving the way it always moved, carrying all of its unfinished business through the dark. In a federal building in Washington, Carl Whitfield sat awake at his own desk, with his own calculation looking at a file he had not opened in 3 years. In a midtown office, Daniel Rice received an email about a routine compliance inquiry and read it twice before his face changed in the specific way that careful men's faces change when something they have been managing carefully shows the first sign of movement. And on the second floor of a building that had 11 months of history connected to a woman with 3 years of intention behind her. Adrian Valenti picked up his phone and found the number of a contact at the Securities Commission and held it for a moment, looking at the screen. Then he pressed call. It rang once, twice, 3 times. "It's Valenti," he said when it picked up. "I need to move something forward, tonight if you're awake." He listened. "Good. I'll explain when I get there." He grabbed his coat. In the hallway outside Elena's door, he paused for exactly 1 second. Then he walked to the stairs and moved into the dark city with the particular stride of a man who had decided something and was now closing the distance between the decision and the consequence. 3 days, maybe 2. Rice was going to surface. And when he did, Elena was going to be standing exactly where he didn't expect her. Adrian's contact at the Securities Commission was a man named Gerald Foss. Gerald was 57 years old, had worked in regulatory compliance for 26 years, and had maintained a quiet, transactional relationship with Adrian for the past 8 of those years that could not be called corruption in the direct sense, and could not be called entirely clean either. It existed in the specific gray territory that sustained a significant portion of the infrastructure between legitimate and illegitimate power in this city, the zone where information moved in exchange for the kind of security that came from being known to be connected to someone who could make certain problems smaller. He met Adrian at a coffee place near his apartment at 11:40 on Wednesday night. He was still in the clothes he'd worn to work. He looked like a man who had been almost asleep and had picked up the phone anyway because a call from Adrian Valenti at 11:30 at night was a call you picked up. Adrian put a folder on the table between them. "Daniel Rice," he said. "His fund. I need a compliance inquiry opened that creates a requirement for Rice to present personally before the Capitol event on the 14th. Gerald opened the folder. He read the first 2 pages. He looked up. "This is real," he said. "Everything in that folder is documented," Adrian said. "Nothing fabricated. The questions it raises are legitimate questions." Where did this come from? Someone who spent 3 years making sure it was airtight before it was used. Gerald read another page. "If I open this inquiry," he said slowly, "it's not something I can close quietly afterward. This level of documentation, this goes somewhere." "I know," Adrian said. Gerald looked at him. "You want it to go somewhere," Gerald said. "I want Rice in a room where he has to answer for what's in that folder," Adrian said. "That's all." Gerald sat back. He looked at the folder. He looked at Adrian. 3 days, he said. 2 if possible. Gerald closed the folder. He picked up his coffee. He put it down without drinking. "All right," he said. "But Adrian, whatever this is, whatever you're building toward with this, I need to not be in the room when it completes." "You won't be," Adrian said. Gerald nodded and took the folder and left. Adrian sat alone at the table for a moment. Then he went home. Elena found out about the call the next morning, not because Adrian told her. He did tell her straightforwardly when she came downstairs at 7 and found him already at his desk, but because she had independently confirmed through her own monitoring that a specific flag had been placed in Rice's fund file at the Commission's database at 12:17 in the morning. She had been watching for it. She had built the alert 3 weeks ago when she first calculated that this was the route she would eventually need to use. What she hadn't known was that Adrian would be the one to pull it. She stood in the doorway of his office. He looked up from his desk. "You already know," he said. "I already know," she said. She came in and sat down across from him. "The inquiry will require Rice to appear," she said. "Personally. Within 48 hours of the notification which goes out this morning." That means he surfaces tomorrow at the latest. Yes. She looked at her hands for a moment. You moved fast, she said. You said 2 days. I said maybe 2 days. I don't like maybes when the timeline matters, he said. She looked at him. There was something in his face that she was still calibrating, a quality of directness that she had initially read as the performance of a powerful man who had learned that appearing decisive was as important as being decisive, and that she was increasingly understanding was simply who he was. He didn't perform decisiveness. He was decisive, and it showed up in his face the same way other people's hesitation showed up in theirs. Thank you, she said, for the second time in 3 days. He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to think of as his real one. Don't thank me, he said. Tell me how we use the 48 hours. Sandra Cho called her lawyer at 8:15 Thursday morning. Elena knew this because Sandra Cho's communications had been monitored through a system Elena had spent 4 months building, not through anything illegal by the narrow technical definition, but through the specific exploitation of the fact that Sandra Cho used a personal email system for communications she considered private, that had a security architecture approximately 5 years behind what it should have been for a woman who had spent the past 3 years managing the legal infrastructure of a major financial crime. The call lasted 11 minutes. The conversation, reconstructed from the patterns Elena could extract without direct access to content, had the shape of a person reporting a development to someone positioned to advise on its implications. The lawyer, a man named Howard Gill, whose name appeared 3 times in Elena's documentation, called 2 other numbers after the call ended. One of them was a number Elena did not have in her existing network. She flagged it. She cross-referenced it. It resolved in 40 minutes. The number belonged to an administrative assistant who worked for Carl Whitfield. She sat with this for a moment. Then she went to find Adrian. He was in the main room with Vincent going over what looked like a property document. She waited in the doorway. He looked up, read her expression, and said to Vincent, "Give us a minute." When Vincent was gone, she said, "Sandra Cho has already made contact up the chain. The contact went to Whitfield's office." "Whitfield moves fast," Adrian said. "He does," she said, "which means the window we thought we had is shorter than 48 hours. He looked at her. "How short?" "I don't know," she said. And she said it plainly without qualification because that was accurate, and accuracy was more useful than confidence right now. He was quiet. "Philip Marsh," he said. "Chicago." "Yes." "What does he have that you need?" "Operational communications," she said. "From the period when the decision about me was made. He managed the message chain. If those records still exist, and I believe they do because Marsh is the kind of person who keeps records for his own protection, they document who authorized what with specificity that no financial trail can provide." "You need Marsh before you need Rice," Adrian said. She paused. He watched her work through it. "I've been building toward Rice as the capstone," she said. "Because his documentation is the financial architecture. But you're right, that the authorization chain matters more for prosecution. If I have Marsh's records, I can bring everything to a prosecutor with a complete picture. Reese becomes confirmation rather than foundation. So, Marsh first. Marsh is in Chicago. I have people in Chicago," he said. She looked at him. "I need to be there myself," she said. "For this one, I need to be present." He looked at her steadily. "Then we go to Chicago," he said. She hadn't expected that either. Not the we. "I don't need," she started. "I know you don't need it," he said. "I'm offering it." She stopped. She looked at him. In the 3 weeks since the night at the Black Orchid, when he had stood across the room and watched a waitress walk toward his fighting ring, Adrian Valenti had done several things that did not fit the profile she had built of him through 11 months of observation. The profile had been accurate, she was confident of that. But what she was discovering was that the profile was accurate about the surface architecture and was only now beginning to fill in what was underneath it. The man underneath it was someone who, once he decided something, committed to it, without the hedging and recalculation that most men used to maintain the appearance of flexibility. He had decided something about Elena, about Catherine, and he was committed to it in a way that she was finding simultaneously useful and difficult to categorize. "Chicago tonight," she said, "if you can be ready." If. She thought about the monitoring systems she needed to put on automated protocols, the files she needed to secure, the specific preparation for a conversation with Philip Marsh that she had been mentally building since she put his name on the list, which she now needed to compress from the version she'd been refining slowly into something she could execute under time pressure. "I can be ready," she said. They were on a private flight by 7 that evening. It was the first time Elena had been on a private aircraft since her old life, and the specific quality of it, the quiet, the insulation from the ordinary friction of commercial travel, the sense of moving through a different tier of the world, landed on her with a physical texture she hadn't anticipated. She sat with her laptop and worked. Adrian sat with a phone and worked. For the first 2 hours, neither of them spoke about anything personal. The conversation was functional. She briefed him on Philip Marsh in the systematic way she briefed herself, the kind of comprehensive download that she normally only did internally, and he listened with the quality of attention he gave everything, asking 3 questions in 2 hours, each of them precise and aimed at the exact edges of what she'd told him, rather than at the center of it. He asked questions the way someone asked questions when they were genuinely building understanding, rather than performing engagement. She filed that. Somewhere over Pennsylvania, he set down his phone. "Tell me about the sister," he said. She looked up from her laptop. "What about her? You said she doesn't know you're alive. You've been carrying that for 3 years. She looked at him for a moment. "Her name is Diane," she said. "She's 4 years younger. She lives in Portland with her husband and a 6-year-old daughter." She paused. "Her daughter's name is Maya." "You know this," he said, "from a distance." "I've kept track," she said, "without contact, without letting her know I was watching." "Why no contact?" "Because contact would have put her in danger," she said. "If the people who were looking for me had found Diane, they would have used her to find me. And the way they would have used her was not," she stopped. "Contact would have made her a target. And now," she looked at her laptop screen, "now it's getting closer to the point where that calculus changes," she said. "When this is finished," he said, "you'll reach out to her." She was quiet. "I don't know what I'll say," she said. "I've been alive for 3 years while she thought I was dead. There's no good version of that conversation." "No," he said. "But she's alive. And you're alive. The conversation exists to be had." She looked at him. "Do you have people like that?" she said. "People you've lost the thread with?" He was quiet for a moment. "My brother," he said. "He left New York 9 years ago. We've spoken 4 times since then." "Why did he leave?" "Because he watched what I was building and decided he didn't want to live close to it," Adrian said. "He was not wrong to make that decision." She looked at him. "Do you miss him?" "Every week," he said, simply, without the performance of casualness that most men used when they admitted to missing something. She looked back at her laptop. "When this is finished," he said again. "Diane?" "When this is finished," she agreed. They flew in silence for a while. The quiet between them had a different quality than the quiet of their earlier silences. The ones in the restaurant, the ones in the hallways of his building. Those silences had been functional or careful or weighted with specific calculation. This one was something simpler. Just 2 people sitting with the parts of themselves that didn't have anything to do with the problem they were moving toward. Philip Marsh lived in a townhouse in Lincoln Park that he had owned for 11 years, and that was by all available external information. The residence of a successful private communications consultant who worked for a small roster of corporate clients and lived a quiet, moderately prosperous life. It was 9:40 Thursday night when Elena stood at the door and rang the bell. She was alone. Adrian was 2 blocks away in a car with 2 of his Chicago contacts men she had been introduced to on the drive from the airport, and had assessed in 30 seconds as competent, loyal, and disciplined enough to stay where they were told. He had not argued about being 2 blocks away. He had made the assessment that her read of the situation was correct, that Philip Marsh was a man who would close the door on 2 people and would open it for one woman who looked like exactly what she was not, and he had gotten in the car without discussion. The door opened. Philip Marsh was 54, lean, with the kind of face that moved between expressions quickly and gave nothing away in transition. He looked at Elena in the way a careful person looked at an unexpected visitor, assessing threat, assessing recognition, assessing the gap between what was presenting and what might be underneath. He did not recognize her. She had counted on this. Philip Marsh had been 3 removes from the operational decision 3 years ago. He had managed the message chain, but he had never been in a room with Catherine Sorrell. He knew a name and a photograph from a file he had been given and subsequently destroyed, and the woman standing at his door in a dark coat, looking tired in the specific way of someone who had traveled a long distance, was not obviously that photograph. "Mr. Marsh," she said. "My name is Elena Valenti. I apologize for the hour. I need about 10 minutes of your time." The last name registered. She saw it register a slight adjustment in his expression, the recalibration that happened when someone connected a name to a network of associations. "I don't believe we've met," he said carefully. "We haven't," she said. "But we have a mutual connection. Raymond Gallo asked me to reach out to you directly." Raymond Gallo's name worked the way she had calculated it would. Marsh's face moved through a sequence of reactions, surprise, then caution, then the specific quality of a man deciding whether to engage or deflect, and landed on a version of reluctant accessibility. "It's late," he said. "It won't take long," she said. He opened the door wider. She went in. He led her to a sitting room and remained standing, which she had also anticipated. A standing host was a host who was managing the duration of an encounter who had not committed to it, extending past the immediate moment. "What message from Gallo?" he said. "There's no message," she said. "I'm sorry. I used his name to get in the door. That was dishonest, and I should have found another approach." Marsh's expression shifted to something colder. "Then who are you?" he said. "My name is genuinely Elena Valenti," she said. "Recently. Before that, it was Elena Moretti. Before that," she watched his face. "Before that," she said, "you knew me as Catherine Sorrell." The silence that followed was the most complete silence she had experienced in 3 years. Philip Marsh looked at her. Every calculation he had been running in the 30 seconds since she walked through his door stopped simultaneously and restarted on an entirely different basis. "You're dead," he said. The words came out with the specific flatness of a statement that a person's mind had accepted as foundational and was now being required to revise. "Apparently not," she said. He looked at the door. "There's a man in a car 2 blocks from here connected to my husband's organization," she said. "Just so you have the full picture. This is a conversation, not an incident, but the geography is what it is." He looked back at her. "What do you want?" he said. "The records," she said. "From the period when the Meridian decision was made about me. The message chain. You managed it. You kept copies." He said nothing. "You kept copies because Philip Marsh doesn't delete insurance," she said. "You've been in too many rooms with too many people who turned on each other to believe that your good standing with them would survive a crisis. You kept copies of everything." He was very still. "I have documentation of the financial architecture," she said. "I have evidentiary records of the money movements. What I don't have is the authorization chain, the specific record of who made the decision and how it was communicated. That's what you have." "And you're asking me to give it to you," he said. "I'm asking you to consider your options," she said. "What I have is already sufficient to expose the Meridian network to federal prosecution. When that happens, and it will happen, the timeline is now very short. The people in that network will look for places to put the weight of it. You managed communications. You'll be a very appealing place to put weight." He was breathing carefully. Unless, she said, you're the person who provided the authorization records, in which case you're the person who cooperated. And cooperation changes what a prosecutor's office does with you considerably. You're asking me to be a witness, he said. I'm asking you to be a smart man, she said. You've always been a smart man. This is the moment where that matters most. He sat down. She waited. Philip Marsh sat in his chair and looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man doing arithmetic that he had hoped he would never have to do. 60 seconds passed. Then he said, I need something in writing, from a federal prosecutor, before I give you anything. I can have that within 72 hours, she said. 72 hours, he repeated. He looked at her. How? Because the inquiry into Rice's fund that goes active tomorrow will create a prosecutor's interest that I'll direct toward a broader investigation within that window, she said. And that prosecutor will want what you have. Another silence. And if I agree, he said slowly, what happens to me? You tell the truth about what you documented, she said. All of it, including the decisions you were part of. He flinched. All of it, she said again, not unkindly, but without qualification. He looked at his hands. There were things I didn't authorize, he said. Things that moved through my system that I wasn't the decision maker. I know, she said. That's exactly why cooperation matters for you specifically. He was quiet for a very long time. 72 hours, he said finally. 72 hours, she confirmed. She stood. She looked at him. Mr. Marsh, I understand this is difficult. He looked up at her. You've been alive this whole time, he said. Not an accusation. Something more confused than that. The specific bewilderment of a man who had closed a chapter in his mind and was now being required to acknowledge that the chapter had never actually ended. Yes, she said. And you came here yourself, he said. You came to my door yourself. Yes. He shook his head slightly. They told me you were ordinary, he said. When they decided you were a problem, they said you were a standard investigator who had found something she shouldn't have and needed to be handled. They were wrong about ordinary, she said. She moved toward the door. Ms. Sorrell, he said. She stopped, but didn't turn. The people above me in the chain, he said. You know who they are. Yes, she said. All of them. She turned. I'm still learning the top of the structure, she said, which is one of the reasons I need what you have. He nodded slowly. He looked like a man who had spent a decade building a particular understanding of his own position in a particular world, and was now watching that understanding dissolve around the edges. I'll have the records ready, he said. She left. In the car, she told Adrian what had happened. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He agreed, he said. He agreed. You walked into the home of a man connected to the people who tried to have you killed and walked out with his cooperation. I walked in with the right information and the right offer, she said. That's not the same as brave, it's just prepared. He looked at her. It's both, he said. She looked out the window at the Chicago streets moving past. I need a prosecutor, she said. Within 72 hours, someone who can offer Marsh protection in exchange for testimony, someone who won't fold under political pressure from Whitfield's network. I know someone, Adrian said. She looked at him. You know a federal prosecutor, she said. I know a federal prosecutor who has been looking for a route into the Meridian network for 2 years, and has been blocked at every turn by people Whitfield influences, Adrian said. Her name is Sarah Okafor. She's in the Southern District. She's clean, I know that specifically, because I've had reason to assess whether she could be influenced and she cannot. Elena absorbed this. You've been building your own map, she said. I've been paying attention for 20 years, he said. Different map. Some of the same territory. She looked at him. Call her tonight, she said. He picked up his phone. He called. She answered on the third ring. He gave her 30 seconds of context, enough to establish the nature of what he was offering, without enough detail to be dismissed as a crank call at 10:30 on a Thursday night. He said 2 specific names. He heard her breathing change. "Tomorrow morning," she said. 8 o'clock. My office. He confirmed and hung up. He looked at Elena. "Tomorrow morning," he said. She nodded. They drove toward the hotel he had arranged, and outside the car, Chicago moved through its Thursday night, and Elena sat with the specific feeling of something she had been holding at arm's length for 3 years, getting close enough to touch. Not relief, not yet, but proximity to something that might eventually become relief. She looked at Adrian in the passing light of the city. He was looking out the window on his side. His profile turned away from her, and she studied it for a moment. The line of it, the specific quality of stillness that was not blankness, but a particular kind of internal focus. He had come to Chicago without making it about himself. He had provided resources without making them conditions. He had called a federal prosecutor at 10:30 on a Thursday night because she needed it done and he could do it. She looked away. She looked at her own hands in her lap. 3 years of alone had produced a version of her that was very good at operating alone and had stopped expecting that any particular problem required more than one person to solve. She had entered the Black Orchid 11 months ago with a plan that accounted for Adrian Valenti as a resource, a powerful node in a network that she needed access to a chess piece of significant value on a board she was playing by herself. She was no longer playing by herself. She was not entirely sure when that had changed. She was not entirely sure what to do with the fact that it had. The hotel appeared ahead. They went inside. At the elevator, Adrian said, "Try to sleep." "You too," she said. The elevator opened. She got in. The doors were closing when she put her hand out and stopped them. He looked at her. "Adrian," she said. He waited. "What you said on the plane," she said. "About your brother." He held her gaze. "When this is finished," she said, "call him." Something moved across his face. He nodded. She let the doors close. She stood alone in the elevator going up and breathed for a moment in the particular way she breathed when she was allowing herself to feel something she had been categorizing as irrelevant. It was not irrelevant. She was not certain yet what it was, but it was not irrelevant. Upstairs in a room with a view. She would keep the blinds open on for the first time in 3 years. She set her laptop on the desk and opened the monitoring system and checked every alert. One new item. Carl Whitfield had made a call at 9:58 that evening. Not to Raymond Gallo, not to Sandra Cho, not to anyone in the existing network, to a number that resolved after 22 minutes of trace work to a private security firm in Virginia that specialized in the specific kind of work that private security firms with no public web presence and billing structures routed through 3 shell companies specialized in. She stared at the screen. She picked up her phone and called Adrian's room. He picked up on the first ring, which told her he hadn't even tried to sleep. "Whitfield has engaged outside contractors," she said. "Professional ones." A pause. "Timeline," he said. "Unknown," she said. "But Whitfield doesn't make this call and wait a week. He makes this call because he's decided something needs to happen before whatever he thinks we're building toward completes." "He knows we're in Chicago," Adrian said. She went cold. "How?" she said. "Because Raymond Gallo told him we were in New York on Wednesday night, and we're not in New York anymore, and a man like Whitfield tracks movement." He paused. "I should have anticipated that. That's on me." "It's on both of us," she said. "We moved the morning meeting up if Okafor can do it." "It's 11:15. Call her again," Elena said. He called. Sarah Okafor, to her considerable credit, and in the way of people who had been chasing something important for 2 years and had just been told it was within reach, answered on the second ring and said 6:30 was fine. 6:30. Elena set down her phone. 7 hours. She looked at the city through the window she had opened the blinds on, and the city looked back without opinion, indifferent and vast, and full of its own unfinished business, and she made herself breathe through it. the proximity of the thing she had been moving toward for 3 years. The specific weight of the moment before, a long movement ended, the knowledge that the ending was close but not yet arrived, and that the distance remaining was where the danger lived. 7 hours. She worked through 4 of them. Then she made herself stop working and sit in the chair by the window and look at the city and let her mind go somewhere that wasn't strategy. She thought about Diane. She thought about Maya, who was 6 years old and who Elena had never met, and who did not know she had an aunt who was alive. She thought about Adrian on the plane, saying every week without performance. She thought about the man she had been when she was Catherine Sorrell, the specific shape of herself before 3 years of survival had compressed and reorganized her, and tried to locate what was still there versus what had been permanently altered. Most of it was still there. She was surprised by how much. She sat with that surprise until the clock showed 4:15, and then she went to the bed and set an alarm for 5:45, and she closed her eyes, and this time she slept. Not well, but she slept. And 3 blocks away, a man in a rental car with Virginia plates sat watching the hotel entrance with the patience of someone who was being paid to watch and had been told to wait for further instruction. He didn't move. He just watched. And 6:30 was coming, and Sarah Okafor was awake already at 4:50, with coffee and the Meridian file she had been building for 2 years, open on her desk, reading it with the focused intensity of a woman who had been told that the thing she'd been trying to reach was going to be in her office in 90 minutes. And Daniel Rice in New York was on the phone with his lawyer at 5 in the morning because the compliance notification had arrived overnight, and his lawyer was telling him the inquiry required personal appearance, and Rice was saying that wasn't possible, and the lawyer was saying it wasn't optional, and Rice was saying find a way, and the lawyer was saying there was no way, not with this documentation, not with whatever had been placed in that file. Everything was moving now. Fast. The way things moved when a long, patient structure finally hit the moment it had been built for. And Elena Moretti Catherine Sorrell, sleeping 3 floors up in a Chicago hotel with the blinds open for the first time in 3 years, was at the center of all of it. Still. The alarm went off at 5:45, and Elena was already awake. She had been awake for 20 minutes, lying still in the dark with her eyes open, running the morning through her mind in the specific sequential way she ran things when she was close to the end of something, and the margin for error had compressed to the point where every decision carried weight it wouldn't have carried earlier. 6:30 with Sarah Okafor, the 72-hour window she had given Marsh. Rice surfacing in New York under the pressure of the compliance inquiry. Whitfield's contractors in a car she hadn't seen but knew were there. She got up, got dressed, checked her monitoring system. The Virginia-plated car was still outside. It hadn't moved. She called Adrian. He picked up before the first ring finished, which meant he had not slept at all. "The car is still there," she said. "I know," he said. "I've had eyes on it since 2. We need to move to Okafor's office without them following." "Already arranged," he said. "Give me 15 minutes. She didn't ask how. She had been learning in the weeks since this began that Adrian Valenti's answers to logistical problems arrived fully formed because he had spent 20 years building the kind of relationships and the kind of operational fluency that made logistics a different category of problem for him than for most people. He didn't explain his methods because they were as automatic to him as her financial analysis was to her. She packed what she needed into a bag that didn't look like a bag that contained what it contained. She met him in the hallway at 6:05. He looked like a man who hadn't slept and had decided that was irrelevant information. She looked at him. "The car," she said. "My people will move it," he said. "Not forcibly. They're going to create a situation 2 blocks north that requires the occupants to make a decision about whether to stay on post or respond. The kind of situation that gets called in to whoever is directing them, and while that call is being made, we'll be in a different vehicle moving south." "How long does that buy us?" "Enough," he said. She believed him. They moved. Sarah Okafor was 41 years old and had the specific kind of focused energy that accumulated in people who had been working toward something important for a long time and had recently been informed that the thing was within reach. She shook Elena's hand at 6:32, with a grip that communicated both urgency and professionalism in equal measure, and she looked at Elena with the direct assessment of someone who had spent 11 years learning to read the difference between people who had what they said they had and people who were performing the having of it. Whatever she read in Elena's face, she sat down immediately and said, "Show me." Elena showed her. It took 40 minutes. Not because the material was difficult to understand. Sarah, Okafor, understood it almost faster than Elena could present it, following the threads of the financial architecture with the ease of someone who had been mapping the same territory from the outside for 2 years and was now seeing the interior for the first time. She asked 6 questions, each of them precise, and aimed at exactly the right stress points. When Elena finished, Sarah sat back. She looked at Adrian. "You're here as her husband," she said, "not as someone I'm going to have a problem with down the road." "I'm here as someone who helped her get to this room," he said. "What happens in this room is hers." Sarah looked at Elena. "Philip Marsh," she said. "He's committed to cooperation." "He wants written protection before he transfers the records," Elena said. "He'll have it within the 72-hour window." "I can have a cooperation agreement drafted by noon," Sarah said. "But I need something from you first." "Name it," Elena said. "Carl Whitfield," Sarah said. Elena looked at her. "I've been blocked from the Meridian network at every significant turn for 2 years," Sarah said. "Each time I've gotten close to the layer above the firm's official structure, something has happened. A key witness has become unavailable. Documentation has developed chain of custody problems. A judge has found reasons to limit the scope of discovery. Not every time, but consistently enough to be a pattern." "Whitfield," Elena said. "I can't prove it," Sarah said. "Not yet. And I can't go after the Meridian principals while he's in a position to interfere, which means—" "You need him first," Elena said. "I need him simultaneously," Sarah said. "Everything has to move at once. Marsh's testimony, Rice's fund records, the Meridian authorization chain, and something that puts Whitfield in a position where his ability to interfere is neutralized before he knows the rest is happening." The room was very quiet. Elena looked at her hands. This was the part she had not fully solved. She had known Whitfield existed in the structure. She had known someone at the insulation layer was managing the interference. She had even suspected it was someone connected to the political consulting world, but she had not had enough on him directly to make him part of the primary plan. He had been too careful, too many removes, too consistent about never being in the same documented space as the decisions he was influencing. She looked up. "The administrative assistant," she said. "The one who received the call from Sandra Cho's lawyer yesterday evening." Sarah looked at her sharply. "You have that," she said. "I have the connection," Elena said. "The call from Howard Gill to Whitfield's office, time-stamped. And I have Jill's prior communications with Sandra Cho that established the chain." "That's not enough for Whitfield directly," Sarah said. "No," Elena agreed. "But it's enough to put pressure on Jill. And Howard Gill has been managing legal architecture for the Meridian people for 3 years, which means he knows things that make his cooperation considerably more valuable than his continued loyalty to people who will absolutely sacrifice him, if the alternative is sacrificing themselves." Sarah looked at her for a long moment. "You want to flip Jill," she said. "I want to give you Jill," Elena said. "What you do with him is your work. But if you move on Gill today before Whitfield knows the inquiry into Rice has activated, before Marsh's cooperation becomes known, you create a situation where Whitfield's interference capability is disrupted at the moment it's most needed." Adrian, who had been sitting quietly to Elena's left, said nothing. He had been saying nothing for 40 minutes, and the quality of his nothing was the quality of a man who understood that this was not his floor and was genuinely comfortable with that. Sarah looked at the documentation Elena had placed on her desk. She looked at Adrian. "You understand," she said to him, "that when this proceeds, some of the individuals implicated will have connections to your world, to your organization." "I know," he said, "and you're comfortable with that proceeding. I identified 4 people in my organization who were part of the Meridian network," he said. "Those 4 have already been removed. Whatever else surfaces in the investigation, I'm not going to stand in front of it. Sarah held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she looked at Elena. All right, she said. I need today to move on, Gil. I need Marcia's agreement formalized by tomorrow. And I need you to be somewhere I can reach you when the Rice situation develops, because his lawyer is going to push back on the inquiry, and I need the documentation you have available to counter whatever he brings. I'll be available, Elena said. And Whitfield's contractors, Sarah said, flat. She said it like she already knew. Elena met her eyes. You know about the car, Elena said. I know Whitfield called a Virginia firm at 9:58 last night, Sarah said. I've been monitoring his communications for a year. I just haven't had enough to move on him until now. She paused. You need to be somewhere safe today while I deal with Jill. I'm not going somewhere safe, Elena said. I'm going back to New York. There's something I need to do before Daniel Rice surfaces. Sarah started to respond. Sarah, Elena said, and the use of the first name direct unqualified the address of one person to another person operating at the same level made the prosecutor stop. I've been building this for 3 years, Elena said. I know how to take care of myself today. What I need from you is to move on Gil before noon. Can you do that? A pause. By 11, Sarah said. They were back in New York by 10:15. The flight was quiet in the way of people who had said what needed to be said and were now in the space between decision and consequence where talking was less useful than thinking. Elena worked. Adrian worked. They landed and moved through the airport with the specific efficiency of people who had somewhere to be and knew exactly how to get there. In the car from the airport, Adrian said, Sandra Cho. Yes, she said, before Rice. Sandra Cho is the legal architect, Elena said. If she receives pressure before Rice surfaces, she has 2 options. She reaches out to Rice directly to coordinate, which tells me exactly where he is, or she starts moving documentation to protect herself, which tells me what she thinks is most exposed. Either way, you get information, Adrian said. Either way, she confirmed. How do you reach her? I don't, Elena said. You do. He looked at her. Sandra Cho has been in your orbit twice in the past year, Elena said. Not closely, but she knows the name. If you call her this morning and invite her to a meeting on the premise of discussing a potential legal engagement, nothing specific, just the general premise of a conversation, she'll come. Because refusing a meeting with Adrian Valenti in her position right now is a risk she won't take. And when she gets there, I'll be there, Elena said. He absorbed this. You're going to be present for the meeting, he said. I'm going to arrive 12 minutes after she does, Elena said, by which point you will have had just enough conversation with her to establish that the meeting is legitimate, so that when I walk in and she understands what the meeting actually is, the psychological ground has already been shifted. He looked at her. 12 minutes, he said. 12 minutes, she confirmed. He made the call to Sandra Cho from the car. Sandra Cho said yes in the specific way that people said yes when they meant I don't want to, but I can't say no. She said 11:30. He said 11:30 was fine. Elena sent a message to her monitoring system. Jill had been reached by Sarah Okafor's office at 10:41. He had asked for 40 minutes to call his lawyer. Sarah had said 30. The dominoes were falling now. Not metaphorically, actually falling in real time in the specific sequence Elena had spent 3 years designing, each one hitting the next, because the arrangement was right and the timing was right, and 3 years of careful, lonely, exhausting patience had produced a structure that was now executing itself. She closed her eyes for 30 seconds. Not to rest, to feel it. Just that, to let herself feel for 30 seconds the specific weight of something that had been carried for a very long time beginning to shift. Then she opened her eyes and checked the next alert. Sandra Cho walked into the meeting at 11:32 with the composed professionalism of a woman who managed her presentation the way she managed everything carefully, deliberately, with awareness of how each element was reading to the people in the room. She had been a lawyer for 17 years. She had walked into difficult rooms many times. She was good at not showing what she was feeling, which was currently something between anxiety and the specific kind of alertness that accompanied awareness that a situation was not fully what it appeared to be. Adrian greeted her. The first 11 minutes were exactly what she had been told. They would be a general conversation about legal services, positioned as preliminary, nothing that required commitment. She relaxed incrementally. She was 3 sentences into explaining her firm's capabilities when the door opened. She turned. She looked at Elena. Her face did something very specific in the 2 seconds before she controlled it. Recognition. Then the specific kind of recognition that went beyond a face to a context, and then a rapid assembly of implications that produced a stillness in her expression that was the closest thing to panic that Sandra Cho was capable of displaying publicly. "Ms. Cho," Elena said, pleasantly. "Thank you for coming." She sat down across from Sandra Cho. She put a folder on the table. She did not open it. "I want to talk to you about the legal structures you built for Meridian Capital," Elena said. "Specifically, the 3-layer corporate architecture you designed to route the fund transfers between 2019 and 2022. I have documentation of all of it. What I'd like to understand from you directly is whether you were designing what you were asked to design, or whether you understood the ultimate purpose of the architecture you were building." Sandra looked at the closed folder. She looked at Adrian. He looked back at her with the expression of a man waiting for a meeting to proceed. She looked at Elena. "That's a very specific question," she said. Her voice was controlled. "Good. She was very good." "It's the question that matters most," Elena said, "because there's a significant difference between a lawyer who designed a structure for a client without full knowledge of its criminal application and a lawyer who designed a criminal financial structure knowingly. The first person is potentially a witness. The second person is a defendant." Sandra's jaw tightened. "I'd like to speak to my lawyer before—" "Howard Gill was taken in for questioning by the Southern District this morning at 11 o'clock, Elena said. The color left Sandra Cho's face. Not gradually. All at once, the way color left a face when a person's mind processed information that removed the floor from a position they had been standing on. "Howard is not—" She stopped. "Howard has been in contact with Carl Whitfield's office consistently for the past 3 years, Elena said. "Managing the interference in the federal investigation of the Meridian Network. The Southern District has that documentation. They also have the call from yesterday evening when you called Howard to report on your assessment of the Gallo situation." Sandra was very still. "You've been monitoring my communications," she said. "I've been monitoring the network," Elena said. "Your communications were part of it." A silence. Sandra Cho sat with whatever was happening inside her, behind a face that was working very hard to remain professional, and was succeeding less than it had been 60 seconds ago. "What do you want?" she said. "The same thing I want from everyone in this network," Elena said. "The truth, documented, on record, in front of a prosecutor." "And if I cooperate, then you're someone who cooperated," Elena said, "which is a very different legal position than where you'll be if you don't." Another silence. Longer. Sandra looked at the closed folder. "Is Daniel Rice aware of how far this has developed?" she said. The question itself was information. It told Elena that Sandra Cho was already calculating the landscape beyond this room, that she was assessing her relative position compared to others in the network, that the competitive logic of self-preservation was already reorganizing her loyalties. "Rice received a compliance notification this morning," Elena said. "He's required to appear personally in connection with a fund inquiry." Sandra absorbed this. "The documentation in that folder," she said. "How complete is it?" "Complete enough to proceed without your cooperation," Elena said. "What your cooperation does is change your position within the proceeding. Sandra Cho looked at the table. She was quiet for 60 seconds. Elena let her be quiet. "I need to speak to a lawyer who is not Howard Gill," Sandra said. "That's a very reasonable thing to need," Elena said. "Sarah Okafor in the Southern District can put you in contact with the appropriate resources." Sandra looked up. She looked at Elena with an expression that had moved past calculation into something more unguarded, the specific look of a person who was facing the thing they had been hoping would stay far enough away to never require facing. "You were supposed to be dead," Sandra said. "I noticed that," Elena said. 3 years ago when they decided—" She stopped herself. "When they decided what?" Elena said quietly. Sandra was quiet. "Ms. Cho," Elena said. "When they decided what—" Sandra looked at her hands. "That you had seen too much and needed to be removed," she said, very low. "I was in the room when that decision was made. I drafted the legal language for the communication that authorized it." The room was completely still. Adrian had not moved. Elena kept her face exactly where it was. "I drafted the language," Sandra said again, as if she needed to hear herself say it. "And I told myself it was just language, that I was just a lawyer doing what lawyers do, writing words for people who would do what they were going to do regardless." She looked up at Elena. "It was the worst decision of my professional life," she said. "I knew it when I made it." Elena looked at her for a long time. "Then tell that to Sarah Okafor," she said. "Tell her exactly what you told me, and tell her who else was in the room." Sandra nodded, slowly, once. "Yes," she said. "Tio." By 2 o'clock Thursday afternoon, Howard Gill was in the Southern District with a lawyer who was not himself and had confirmed 3 names, including Carl Whitfield, in exchange for the specific protections that people who were third-tier participants in something larger received when they made the right decision at the right time. By 3:15, Sandra Cho had been connected to a prosecutor's office representative and had begun the process of formal cooperation. By 4:40, Daniel Rice appeared personally at a regulatory hearing to address the compliance inquiry, which had been constructed so carefully and documented so thoroughly that his lawyer's attempts to limit its scope failed at each effort. During the hearing, 2 additional sets of documentation that Elena had provided through Sarah Okafor's office were introduced into evidence. Rice's lawyer asked for a recess. The request was denied. By 6 o'clock, Rice had requested cooperation terms. Elena was in Adrian's building when Vincent came in and told her. She was sitting at her desk. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "And Whitfield." "Southern District moved on him at 4, Vincent said. "He's retained counsel. But with Jill's testimony and whatever Cho is providing, the buffer is gone. He has nowhere to root the interference." She nodded. Vincent left. She sat alone. The monitoring system was quiet. All the alerts she had spent 3 years building and maintaining and checking with the specific obsessive consistency of someone who could not afford to miss the signal when it came quiet. Not because they had been turned off, because the network they were monitoring was in the process of dismantling itself, each piece falling, the way pieces fell when the structural logic that held them together was removed. She put both hands flat on the desk. She breathed, in, out. She became aware of Adrian standing in the doorway. She hadn't heard him come up the stairs. He was just there the way he had a way of being present that she had started to find less surprising and more simply true. "It's done," she said. "Almost," he said. "The core is done," she said. "The rest is Sarah's work, the prosecution, the proceedings, the public record." She paused. "That'll take months, maybe a year. But the structure is broken. Whitfield can't interfere anymore. The principals are in cooperation or in custody. The network is—" She stopped. "Finished," Adrian said. "Finished," she said. He came in. He sat down in the chair across from her desk, the chair she sat in when she was on the other side of conversations with him, and he looked at her with the expression she knew now as his most real one. "How do you feel?" he said. She considered the question. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I've been building toward this for so long that I'm not sure what the space after it feels like. I haven't been in that space in 3 years. What did it feel like before?" he said. "Before all of this?" She thought about it. "Ordinary," she said. "I felt ordinary things. I got tired after long days. I had a favorite coffee place that I went to on Saturday mornings. I argued with my sister about nothing important. I read books that had nothing to do with any of this." She looked at her hands. "I liked my work because I was good at it and it mattered. I didn't know yet that it was going to cost what it cost." "Would you have made different choices?" he said. "If you'd known." She looked up at him. "No," she said, without hesitation. "No," he agreed, as if he had expected that answer. "Would you?" she said. "All of this the last 3 weeks, the Chicago trip, the prosecutor, the 4 people in your organization. If you'd known what the Friday night fight was going to cost you." He looked at her. "No," he said. The word sat between them. The thing between them, the thing she had been cataloging and filing under not the right time and not the right context and too much in motion right now, had no more motion to hide behind. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I'm going to call Diane tonight," she said. Something moved in his face. "Tonight," he said. "I've been waiting for it to be safe," she said. "It's safe now, or close enough to safe that waiting further is just fear dressed as strategy." She paused. "You told me on the plane that she's alive, and I'm alive, and the conversation exists to be had." "I did," he said. "You were right," she said. He was quiet. "Will you stay?" she said, "while I make the call, not in the room, just in the building." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. She nodded. She looked at the desk. "Adrian," she said. "Yes." "Thank you." She said it differently than the previous 2 times. Not for a specific action, not for a logistical contribution, for something larger and less definable, for the quality of presence that had made the last 3 weeks different from the 3 years before them, in a way that she didn't have complete language for yet, but understood was significant. He said nothing, which was the right thing to say. She called Diane at 8:17 that evening. She sat on the bed in her room with the phone in both hands for 40 seconds before she pressed the call button. The 40 seconds were not hesitation. The decision was made, had been made since the plane had probably been made before that, in some layer underneath the tactical thinking that she hadn't let surface until tonight. The 40 seconds were the specific experience of standing at the edge of something irreversible and allowing yourself to know that before you stepped. Then she pressed call. It rang 3 times. Diane picked up. "Hello." The voice of someone who didn't recognize the number. The cautious but not alarmed voice of a person receiving an unknown call on an ordinary Thursday evening. Elena opened her mouth. What came out was not the carefully constructed version of this conversation she had been composing for 3 years in her head. It was not logical or sequenced or organized around the information that needed to be delivered in the right order. What came out was, "Di, it's Kate." And then 6 seconds of silence that contained everything. "Kate," Diane said. Not a question, not an exclamation, just the name. The name that had not been said aloud to her in 3 years. Said in the voice of her sister, who she had been told was dead, whose death she had grieved, whose absence she had been carrying for 37 months in the specific way that people carry losses they don't understand and can't properly resolve. "I'm alive," Elena said. "I'm sorry it took this long. I'm alive and I'm okay and I'm going to explain everything. But I needed you to know that first. Just that. The sound Diane made was not crying, and was not speaking, and was not silence. It was something that didn't have a name, because the situation that produced it didn't have a category. "Kate," she said again. "I'm here," Elena said. "You're here," Diane said. "I'm here," Elena said. "I'm here." They stayed on the phone for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Elena did not leave the room once. Downstairs, Adrian sat in his office with work. He wasn't doing available the way he had said he would be. Not intruding. Not checking, just present in the way that some people knew how to be present without making their presence a demand on anyone. At 10:58, Elena came downstairs. Her eyes were red in the specific way of someone who had been crying and was not self-conscious about it. She sat down across from Adrian. He looked at her. "She knew," Elena said. "Part of her knew I wasn't dead. She said she never completely believed it. She said it didn't feel finished." "Sisters," he said. "She has a daughter," Elena said. "Maya. She kept sending birthday cards to a grave for 3 years. Cards addressed to Aunt Kate. She kept sending them because she told Maya that her aunt was somewhere far away and they were going to meet her one day." Her voice held steady, but just barely. "When can you go?" he said. "She wants me there this weekend," Elena said. "I told her I would come." He nodded. She looked at him. "Come with me," she said. He went still. "Portland," she said. "This weekend. Come with me." He looked at her. "You don't have to," she said. "I know it's—" "I'll come," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Adrian," she said. "Yes, I've been alone in this for 3 years," she said, "and I planned for that. I built the whole thing to be executable alone because I couldn't trust that it wouldn't need to be. But somewhere in the last 3 weeks—" She stopped. "You stopped being alone in it," he said. "Yes," she said. He held her gaze. "I noticed," he said, "when it happened." "When?" she said. "The plane," he said. "Going to Chicago. When you asked me about my brother, you weren't gathering information, you were just asking, because you wanted to know." She was quiet. "That was the first time," he said, "that you talked to me instead of at me." She almost smiled. "I didn't realize you noticed the difference," she said. "I notice everything about you," he said, simply, without performance. The statement of a fact that he was not going to dress up or qualify. She looked at him. The room was quiet. The city outside was doing what the city always did. Moving continuous, carrying its millions of unfinished stories through the night without knowing or caring about any individual one. But in this room, in this particular quiet, 2 people who had arrived at each other by the most indirect and improbable route that could be imagined were sitting with the specific knowledge that the indirection had not been accidental. It had been necessary, every step of it.
My God.
3 weeks later, Carl Whitfield was indicted on 4 counts of obstruction of justice, 2 counts of conspiracy, and 1 count that his own lawyers described to him privately as the one most likely to result in a sentence that would outlast his remaining actuarial projection. Daniel Rice reached a cooperation agreement that required full disclosure of the Meridian financial architecture and personal testimony in the prosecution of 6 other individuals in exchange for a reduced sentence that his lawyer described as the best available outcome in an extremely limited range of available outcomes. Sandra Cho received a conditional immunity agreement in exchange for testimony that included in a federal courtroom in Lower Manhattan a precise account of a meeting 3 years earlier in which a decision had been made about a financial investigator named Catherine Sorrell and of the legal language Sandra Cho had drafted to facilitate that decision, and of the names of every person who had been present in the room when it happened. Philip Marsh delivered his records as agreed. The authorization chain they contained was complete, contemporaneous, and unambiguous. Sarah Okafor's office described it in an internal communication that was later disclosed in the proceedings as the single most comprehensive piece of documentary evidence in a financial crime prosecution in the Southern District in 7 years. The 4 people Adrian had removed from his organization were identified to investigators who were satisfied with the accounting. Adrian's cooperation provided through counsel carefully structured extending no further than was necessary, and not one step further was noted in the record. The investigation of the Meridian Network produced ultimately 14 indictments across 3 years of subsequent proceedings. 11 of those resulted in convictions. The financial architecture that had moved money for the better part of a decade through the vehicles Sandra Cho had designed was dismantled by federal order and the assets frozen. Catherine Sorrell was named in the proceedings as the originating investigator whose documentation formed the evidentiary foundation of the prosecution. The name appeared in the court record, in public documents, in the reporting that followed, which was extensive because the story had the quality of things that people needed to understand had actually happened, that power had been exercised in this specific way, and that someone had spent 3 years making sure it didn't stay buried. Elena read her name in the public record and sat with it for a long time. Then she put down the paper and went to find her husband. In Portland on a Saturday in December, with winter coming in off the coast, in the specific way it came to that city, persistent soft, the kind of cold that settled rather than struck. Elena sat at her sister's kitchen table with a 6-year-old girl named Maya on the chair beside her. Maya had dark brown eyes that were exactly like her mother's, and nothing in her face that had been taught to be careful or strategic or controlled. She looked at things directly with the complete openness of someone who had not yet learned that openness cost anything, and she had been sitting next to Elena for 20 minutes with the focused attention of a child who had been told that this person was important and had decided to verify that assessment independently. "Mom said you were far away," Maya said. "I was," Elena said. "Where?" "New York," Elena said. "And before that, other places." Maya considered this. "Did you like it there?" "Parts of it," Elena said. "I like it better now." Maya looked at Adrian, who was sitting across the table talking to Diane's husband with the particular ease of a man who was good at making people feel comfortable and was making a genuine effort to exercise that skill in a context that mattered to someone he cared about. "Is that your husband?" Maya said. "Yes," Elena said. "He's tall," Maya said. "He is?" Elena agreed. Maya appeared to find this satisfactory. She leaned slightly against Elena's arm. The contact was small and completely natural and completely unexpected, and Elena felt it arrive somewhere in her chest that had been very defended for a very long time. She looked at Diane across the room. Diane was watching her. Her sister's eyes had the particular quality of someone who had spent 3 years grieving and was still in the first weeks of learning what it felt like to have the grief replaced by something that was harder to name but was better in every way that mattered. Diane smiled. Elena smiled back. Across the table, Adrian caught her eye. He was in the middle of a sentence with Diane's husband, and he looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Just that. Just the look. Just the small, private communication of a person checking on another person they had decided was someone worth checking on. And then he returned to the conversation without making anything of it. She looked at Maya, who had found something interesting in the grain of the table and was tracing it with one small finger. "Maya," she said. Maya looked up. "I'm going to be around now," Elena said. "For real." Maya looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated assessment of childhood. "Promise," she said. Elena looked at her, at the small face, at the dark eyes, at the complete openness of someone who had been told to expect something and wanted to know if the expectation was reliable. "Promise," Elena said. She said it the way she said things that were true, without qualification, without exit, the way a woman said something when she had finished running from the past and had decided with the full weight of everything she had survived, and everything she had built, and everyone she was choosing to keep close, that the life in front of her was the one she was going to live. Completely. Out loud. Without hiding. The woman who had walked into a room full of powerful men with nothing but a folded apron and 3 years of unfinished business had finished her business. She had done it on her own terms, with her own evidence, through her own choices, and she had done it without becoming what the people who feared her had always suspected she was, which was the most important part. She was still Catherine Sorel. She was still Elena Moretti. She was still every version of herself that had survived the years between those two names. And she was here at a kitchen table in Portland in December, with her niece leaning against her arm, and her husband's voice in the background, and her sister's eyes across the room, and the world outside was cold and ordinary and full of its own unfinished stories, and she was part of it again. Not hiding, not running, not invisible. Just here. And here it turned out was exactly enough.